The story of Vikramaditya in Myths and Legends Around the World, Collection 10. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Story of Vikramaditya by Alice Elizabeth Dracott. The Story of Vikramaditya. A king once asked his daughters to tell him the reason why they were so comfortable and always clothed in fine raiment, with jewels to wear and a palace to live in. They all said, "It is because we are your daughters, O king." But the youngest said, "I am what I am through my favorable destiny, and not because I happen to be your daughter. If good fortune be destined for us, we shall have it under any circumstances." At this the king was very angry and said, "Leave my palace at once, and see what your own luck will do for you. Methinks your lucky stars will cease to shine once you have left my palace." But in order to further humiliate her, he determined to get her married to the poorest man in his kingdom, and one who was weak and sickly and about to die. He therefore sent his servants to bring the first sickly-looking pauper they could find. Now it so happened about this time that one Vikramaditya, a holy mendicant, was lying outside the palace gates, stricken down with great suffering and almost at the point of death, and they brought him as the most suitable man for the young princess to marry. The poor beggar Vikramaditya was in reality a great king, who once reigned over the ancient and holy city of Ujjain, but he had abdicated his throne in order to become a sannyasi, or begging fakir, and was then on a pilgrimage to Kasi, the holy city of Benares, where he hoped to pass the rest of his days in prayer and the deeds of charity for which he was well known. The sickness with which he was stricken down at the gates of the king's palace was caused through his great love for God's creatures, and happened in this way. One day, as he was walking along footsore and tired, a snake came up to him and said, "Can you give me some water to drink? For I am dying of thirst." Vikramaditya replied, "I have no water in my gourd, having just drank it. But if you will promise not to harm me, you may creep down my throat into my body, and there drink your fill and return satisfied." This the snake promised, but instead of returning, it remained within him and refused to come back. All that the beggar ate passed into the mouth of the snake, and in this way he soon found himself unable to travel and obliged to rest, suffering at the same time great agonies from starvation and thirst. When the king's servants found and brought him to the palace, the young princess was there, and then forced to marry Vikramaditya, and expelled from the town with a beggar husband. Both king and queen expressed a hope at parting that she would soon learn the lesson that it was all due to them alone that she had fared so well hitherto. As Vikramaditya could not travel very far owing to weakness, she took shelter in the first small hut she could find, and there stayed, trying to alleviate his sufferings. Now, near this hut was a mound of earth in which dwelt a snake. In the evenings, as is usual in India, the snake came out of his hole and stood on the mound of earth, where he hissed violently. The snake, which lived inside Vikramaditya, heard the sound and hissed in reply. Then they began a conversation. The snake on the mound said, "You traitor! You were given permission to drink water, and this is how you treat the holy fakir and break your promise to return without doing him any harm. You shall now be given a certain seed to eat, which will entirely destroy your body and you will die in agonies." The other snake replied, "You miser, you dog in the manger, who live over a mound beneath which lies vast treasures and priceless jewels. You know that you cannot use them yourself, and yet you will allow nobody else to touch them. Your end will be that a woman will kill you by pouring boiling milk and butter over you." The young wife heard these two snakes denouncing each other and determined to act upon what she had overheard. When leaving her father's house, she had managed to hide on her person a small pearl ring, and this she now pawned for a small sum of money and purchased milk and butter. Warming these to boiling point, she went over at midday and poured them into the snake's hole in the mound. She also sought the seed which would kill the snake her husband had swallowed, and gave it to him to eat. Thus both snakes were killed and all danger from them ceased to exist. Vikramaditya, after the destruction of the snake, improved rapidly and soon regained his health and strength. The young wife now turned her attention to the mound of earth beneath which lay buried treasures. She employed a few men to dig, and they soon unearthed several ghurras or earthen vessels full of priceless gems. With this she went away and very soon founded a great city over which she made her lord king. Thus Vikramaditya once more reigned a king, and no queen was more famous than the young princess who had been so cruelly cast adrift by her father. The old father heard of this new king and of all the riches and splendor of his court and queen, and he sent men to enquire if it were true that his daughter was really as great as people reported. The men returned and said, "O king, her riches, the magnificence of her court and palace surpass all we have heard. She is indeed a great queen and has founded a mighty city." The king then owned his mistake and said, "My daughter was right when she said her greatness was due more to her individual luck than to the mere fact that she happened to be born my daughter. For has she not, in spite of all my ill treatment of her, risen to be queen, not of a small kingdom such as mine, but of a world-renowned kingdom?" Moral: Thy kismet is thy fate. When that is good, then the most unfavorable circumstances or the deepest gloom cannot prevent its asserting itself. End of the story of Vikramaditya. Read by Chinmay Kumar Hota, Bhubaneswar, India, on 20th June 2021. The Talkative Tortoise in Myths and Legends Around the World, Collection 10. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Talkative Tortoise by Joseph Jacobs. The Talkative Tortoise. The future Buddha was once born in a minister's family when Brahmadatta was reigning in Benares, and when he grew up, he became the king's advisor in things temporal and spiritual. Now, this king was very talkative. While he was speaking, others had no opportunity for a word, and the future Buddha, wanting to cure this talkativeness of his, was constantly seeking for some means of doing so. At that time there was living in a pond in the Himalaya mountains a tortoise. Two young hamsas or wild ducks who came to feed there made friends with him. And one day, when they had become very intimate with him, they said to the tortoise, "Friend tortoise, the place where we live, at the Golden Cave on Mount Beautiful in the Himalaya country, is a delightful spot. Will you come there with us? But how can I get there? We can take you if you can only hold your tongue and will say nothing to anybody. Oh, that I can do. Take me with you. That's right, said they, and making the tortoise bite hold of a stick, they themselves took the two ends in their teeth and flew up into the air. Seeing him thus carried by the Hamsas, some villagers called out, "Two wild ducks are carrying a tortoise along on a stick." Whereupon the tortoise wanted to say, "If my friends choose to carry me, what is that to you, you wretched slaves?" So, just as the swift flight of the wild ducks had brought him over the king's palace in the city of Benares, he let go of the stick he was biting, and falling in the open courtyard, split in two. And there arose a universal cry, "A tortoise has fallen in the open courtyard and has split in two." The king, taking the future Buddha, went to the place, surrounded by his courtiers, and looking at the tortoise, he asked the Bodhisattva, "Teacher, how comes he to be fallen here?" The future Buddha thought to himself, "Long expecting, wishing to admonish the king, have I sought for some means of doing so. This tortoise must have made friends with the wild ducks, and they must have made him bite hold of the stick, and have flown up into the air to take him to the hills. But he, being unable to hold his tongue when he hears anyone else talk, must have wanted to say something, and let go the stick, and so must have fallen down from the sky, and thus lost his life." And saying, "Truly, O king, those who are called chatterboxes, people whose words have no end, come to grief like this," he uttered these verses. Verily the tortoise killed himself whilst uttering his voice, though he was holding tight the stick, by a word himself he slew. Behold him then, O excellent by strength, and speak wise words not out of season. You see how, by his talking overmuch, the tortoise fell into this wretched plight. The king saw that he was himself referred to, and said, "O teacher, are you speaking of us?" And the Bodhisattva spake openly and said, "O great king, be it thou or be it any other, whoever talks beyond measure meets with some mishap like this." And the king henceforth refrained himself and became a man of few words. End of The Talkative Tortoise. Read by Chinmay Kumar Hota, Bhubaneswar, India, 22nd June 2021.
The Beggar King in Myths and Legends Around the World, Collection 10. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Proud King Hagag sat on his throne in state, and the high priest standing by his side read from the holy book, as was his daily custom. He read these words, "For riches are not forever, and doth the crown endure to every generation?" "Cease," cried the king. "Who wrote those words?" "They are the words of the holy book," answered the high priest. "Give me that book," commanded the king. With trembling hands, the high priest placed it before his majesty. King Hagag gazed earnestly at the words that had been read, and he frowned. Raising his hand, he tore the page from the book and threw it to the ground. "I, Hagag, am king," he said, "and all such passages that offend me shall be torn out." He flung the volume angrily from him, while the high priest and all his courtiers looked on in astonishment. "I have heard enough for today," he said. "Too long have I delayed my hunting expedition. Let the horses be got ready." He descended from the throne, stalked haughtily past the trembling figure of the high priest, and went forth to the hunt. Soon he was riding furiously across an open plain toward a forest where a wild stag had been seen. A trumpet sounded the signal that the deer had been driven from its hiding place, and the king urged his horse forward to be the first in the chase. His Majesty's steed was the swiftest in the land. Quickly it carried him out of sight of his nobles and attendants. But the deer was surprisingly fleet, and the king could not catch up with it. Coming to a river, the animal plunged in and swam across. Scrambling up the opposite bank, its antlers caught in the branch of a tree, and the king, arriving at the river, gave a cry of joy. "Now I have thee," he said, springing from his horse and divesting himself of all his clothing, he swam across with naught but a sword. As he reached the opposite bank, however, the deer freed itself from the tree and plunged into a thicket. The king, with his sword in his hand, followed quickly, but no deer he could see. Instead, he found lying on the ground beside the thicket a beautiful youth clad in deerskin. He was panting as if after a long run. The king stood still in surprise, and the youth sprang to his feet. "I am the deer," he said. "I am a genie, and I have lured thee to this spot, proud king, to teach thee a lesson for thy words this morning." Before King Hagag could recover from his surprise, the youth ran back to the river and swam across. Quickly he dressed himself in the king's clothes and mounted the horse just as the other hunters came up. They thought the genie was King Hagag, and they halted before him. "Let us return," said the genie. "The deer has crossed the river and escaped." King Hagag from the thicket on the opposite side watched them ride away, then flung himself on the ground and wept bitterly. There he lay until a woodcutter found him. "What do you here?" asked the man. "I am King Hagag," returned the monarch. "Thou art a fool," said the woodcutter. "Thou art a lazy, good-for-naught to talk so. Come, carry my bundle of sticks, and I will give thee food and an old garment." In vain the king protested. The woodcutter only laughed the more, and at last, losing patience, he beat him and drove him away. Tired and hungry, and clad only in the rags which the woodcutter had given him, King Hagag reached the palace late at night. "I am King Hagag," he said to the guards, but roughly they bade him begone, and after spending a wretched night on the streets of the city, his Majesty, next morning, was glad to accept some bread and milk offered to him by a poor old woman, who took pity on him. He stood at the street corner, not knowing what to do. Little children teased him. Others took him for a beggar, and offered him money. Later in the day he saw the genie ride through the streets on his horse. All the people bowed before him and cried, "Long live the king!" "Woe is me!" cried Hagag, in his wretchedness. "I am punished for my sin in scoffing at the words of the holy book." He saw that it would be useless for him to go to the palace again, and he went into the fields and tried to earn his bread as a laborer. He was not used to work, however, and but for the kindness of the very poorest, he would have died of starvation. He wandered miserably from place to place until he fell in with some blind beggars, who had been deserted by their guide. Joyfully he accepted their offer to take the guide's place. Months rolled by, and one morning the royal heralds went forth and announced that good King Hagag would be giving a feast a week from that day to all the beggars in the land. From far and near came beggars in hundreds to partake of the king's bounty, and Hagag stood among them, with his blind companions in the courtyard of the palace, waiting for his Majesty to appear. He knew the place well, and he hung his head and wept. "His Majesty will speak to each one of you who are his guests today," cried a herald. And one by one they passed into the palace and stood before the throne. When it came to Hagag's turn, he trembled so much that he had to be supported by the guards. The genie on the throne and Hagag looked long at each other. "Art thou too a beggar?" said the genie. "Nay, gracious Majesty," answered Hagag with a bent head. "I have sinned grievously, and have been punished. I am but the servant of the troop of blind beggars, to whom I act as a guide." The genie king signed to his courtiers that he desired to be left alone with Hagag. Then he said, "Hagag, I know thee. I see that thou hast repented. It is well. Now canst thou resume thy rightful place." "Gracious Majesty," said Hagag, I have learned humility and wisdom. The throne is not for me. The blind beggars need me. Let me remain in their service." "It cannot be," said the genie. "I see that thou art truly penitent. Thy lesson is learned, and my task is done. I will see that the blind beggars lack not." With his own hands he placed the royal robes on Hagag, and himself donned those of the beggar. When the courtiers returned, they saw no difference. King Hagag sat on the throne again, and nowhere in the whole world was there a monarch who ruled more wisely or showed more kindness and sympathy to all of his subjects. End of The Beggar King. The Legend of Ra and Isis by E. A. Wallace Budge. In Myths and Legends Around the World, Collection 10. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. It has already been seen that the god Ra, when retiring from the government of this world, took steps through Thoth to supply mankind with words of power and spells with which to protect themselves against the bites of serpents and other noxious reptiles. The legend of the destruction of mankind affords no explanation of this remarkable fact, but when we read the following legend of Ra and Isis, we understand why Ra, though king of the gods, was afraid of the reptiles which lived in the kingdom of Keb. The legend, or chapter of the divine god, begins by enumerating the mighty attributes of Ra as the creator of the universe, and describes the god of many names as unknowable, even by the gods. At this time Isis lived in the form of a woman who possessed the knowledge of spells and incantations, that is to say, she was regarded much in the same way as modern African people regard their medicine woman or witch woman. She had used her spells on men and was tired of exercising her powers on them, and she craved the opportunity of making herself mistress of gods and spirits as well as of men. She meditated how she could make herself mistress of both heaven and earth, and finally she decided that she could only obtain the power she wanted if she possessed the knowledge of the secret name of Ra, in which his very existence was bound up. Ra regarded this name most jealously, for he knew that if he revealed it to any being, he would henceforth be at the being's very mercy. Isis saw that it was impossible to make Ra declare his name to her by ordinary methods, and she therefore thought out the following plan. It was well known in Egypt and the Sudan at a very early period that if a magician obtained some portion of a person's body, example, a hair, a paring of a nail, a fragment of skin, or a portion of some efflux from the body, spells could be used upon them which would have the effect of causing grievous harm to that person. Isis noted that Ra had become old and feeble, and that as he went about he dribbled at the mouth, and that his saliva fell upon the ground. Watching her opportunity, she caught some of the saliva and mixed it with dust. She molded it into the form of a large serpent with poison fangs, and having uttered her spells over it, she left the serpent lying on the path by which Ra traveled day by day, as he went about inspecting Egypt, so that it might strike at him as he passed along. We may note in passing that the Banyoro in the Sudan employ serpents in killing buffaloes at the present day. They catch a pufferer in a noose and then nail it alive by the tip of its tail to the round in the middle of the buffalo track, so that when an animal passes the reptile may strike it. Presently a buffalo comes along, does what it is expected to do, and then the puff adder strikes at it, injects its poison, and the animal dies soon after. As many as 10 buffaloes have been killed in that day by one puff adder. The body of the first buffalo is not eaten, for it is regarded as poisoned meat, but all the others are used as food. Soon after Isis had placed the serpent on the path, Ra passed by, and the reptile bit him, thus injecting poison into his body. Its effect was terrible, and Ra cried out in agony. His jaw chattered, his lips trembled, and he became speechless for a time. Never before had he suffered such pain. The gods, hearing his cry, rushed to him, and when he could speak, he told them that he had been bitten by a deadly serpent. In spite of all the words of power which were known to him, and his secret name which had been hidden in his body at his birth, a serpent had bitten him, and he was being consumed with a fiery pain. He then commanded that all the gods who had any knowledge of magical spells should come to him, and when they came, Isis, the great lady of the spells, the destroyer of diseases, and the revivifier of the dead, came with them. Turning to Ra, she said, "What hath happened, O divine father?" And in answer the god told her that a serpent had bitten him, that he was hotter than fire and colder than water, that his limbs quaked, and that he was losing the power of sight. Then Isis said to him with guile, "Divine father, tell me thy name, for he who uttereth his own name shall live." Thereupon Ra proceeded to enumerate the various things that he had done, and to describe his creative acts, and ended his speech to Isis by saying that he was Khafera in the morning, Ra at noon, and Tamu in the evening. Apparently he thought that the naming of these three great names would satisfy Isis, and that she would immediately pronounce a word of power and stop the pain in his body, which, during his speech, had become more acute. Isis, however, was not deceived, and she knew well that Ra had not declared to her his hidden name. This she told him, and she begged him once again to tell her his name. For a time the god refused to utter the name, but as the pain in his body became more violent, and the poison passed through his veins like fire, he said, "Isis shall search in me, and my name shall pass from my body into hers." At that moment Ra removed himself from the side of the gods in his boat, and the throne in the boat of millions of years had no occupant. The great name of Ra was, it seems, hidden in his heart, and Isis, having some doubt as to whether Ra would keep his word or not, agreed with Horus that Ra must be made to take an oath to part with his two eyes, that is, the sun and the moon. At length Ra allowed his heart to be taken from his body, and his great and secret name, whereby he lived, passed on to the possession of Isis. Ra thus became to all intents and purposes a dead god. Then Isis, strong in the power of her spell, said, "Flow, poison, come out of Ra. Eye of Horus, come out of Ra and shine outside his mouth. It is I, Isis, who work, and I have made the poison to fall on the ground. Verily the name of the great god is taken from him. Ra shall live, and the poison shall die. If the poison live, Ra shall die." This was the infallible spell which was to be used in case of poisoning, for it rendered the bite or sting of every venomous reptile harmless. It drove the poison out of Ra, and since it was composed by Isis after she obtained the knowledge of his secret name, it was irresistible. If the words were written on papyrus or linen over a figure of Tamu or Heru Hekhenu, or Isis or Horus, they might become a mighty charm. If the papyrus or linen was steeped in water and the water drunk, the words were equally efficacious as a charm against snake bites. To this day, water in which the written words of a text from the Quran have been dissolved, or water drunk from a bowl on the inside of which religious texts have been written, is still regarded as a never-failing charm in Egypt and the Sudan. Thus we see that the modern custom of drinking magical water was delivered from the ancient Egyptians, who believed that it conveyed into their bodies the actual power of their gods. End of the legend of Ra and Isis.
Vasilisa the Fair in Myths and Legends Around the World, Collection 10. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Kimmy Weldon. Vasilisa the Fair by W.R.S. Ralston. In a certain kingdom there lived a merchant. 12 years did he live as a married man, but he had only one child, Vasilisa the Fair. When her mother died, the girl was 8 years old, and on her deathbed the merchant's wife called her little daughter to her, took out from under the bedclothes a doll, gave it to her, and said, "Listen, Vasilisa dear, remember and obey these last words of mine. I am going to die, and now, together with my parental blessing, I bequeath to you this doll. Keep it always by you, and never show it to anybody. And whenever any misfortune comes upon you, give the doll food and ask its advice. When it is fed, it will tell you a cure for your troubles." Then the mother kissed her child and died. After his wife's death, the merchant mourned her for a befitting time, and then began to consider about marrying again. He was a man of means. It wasn't a question with him of girls with dowries. More than all others, a certain widow took his fancy. She was middle-aged, and had a couple of daughters of her own just about the same age as Vasilisa. She must needs be both a good housekeeper and an experienced mother. Well, the merchant married the widow, but he had deceived himself, for he did not find in her a kind mother for his Vasilisa. Vasilisa was the prettiest girl in all the village, but her stepmother and stepsisters were jealous of her beauty, and tormented her with every possible sort of toil, in order that she might grow thin from overwork and be tanned by the sun and the wind. Her life was made a burden to her. Vasilisa bore everything with resignation, and every day grew plumper and prettier, while the stepmother and her daughters lost flesh and fell off in appearance from the effects of their own spite, notwithstanding that they always sat with folded hands like fine ladies. But how did that come about? Why, it was her doll that helped Vasilisa. If it hadn't been for it, however could the girl have got through all her work? And therefore it was that Vasilisa would never eat all her share of a meal, but always kept the most delicate morsel for her doll. And at night, when all were at rest, she would shut herself up in the narrow chamber in which she slept, and feast her doll, saying the while, "There, dolly, feed. Help me in my need. I live in my father's house, but never know what pleasure is. My evil stepmother tries to drive me out of the white world. Teach me how to keep alive, and what I ought to do." Then the doll would eat, and afterwards give her advice, and comfort her in her sorrow. And next day it would do all Vasilisa's work for her. She had only to take her ease in a shady place and pluck flowers, and yet all her work was done in good time. The beds were weeded, and the pails were filled, and the cabbages were watered, and the stove was heated. Moreover, the doll showed Vasilisa herbs which prevented her from getting sunburnt. Happily did she and her doll live together. Several years went by. Vasilisa grew up and became old enough to be married. All the marriageable young men in the town sent to make an offer to Vasilisa. At her stepmother's daughters not a soul would so much as look. Her stepmother grew even more savage than before, and replied to every suitor, "We won't let the younger marry before her elders." And after the suitors had been packed off, she used to beat Vasilisa by way of wreaking her spite. Well, it happened one day that the merchant had to go away from home on business for a long time. Thereupon the stepmother went to live in another house, and near that house was a dense forest, and in a clearing in that forest there stood a hut. And in the hut there lived a Baba Yaga. She never let anyone come near her dwelling, and she ate up people like so many chickens. Having moved into the new abode, the merchant's wife kept sending her hated Vasilisa into the forest on one pretense or another. But the girl always got home safe and sound. The doll used to show her the way, and never let her go near the Baba Yaga's dwelling. The autumn season arrived. One evening the stepmother gave out their work to the 3 girls. One she set to lace-making, another to knitting socks, and the third, Vasilisa, to weaving. And each of them had her allotted amount to do. By and by she put out the lights in the house, leaving only one candle alight where the girls were working, and then she went to bed. The girls worked and worked. Presently the candle wanted snuffing. One of the stepdaughters took the snuffers, as if she were going to clear the wick, but instead of doing so, in obedience to her mother's orders, she snuffed the candle out, pretending to do so by accident. "What shall we do now?" said the girls. "There isn't a spark of fire in the house, and our tasks are not yet done. We must go to the Baba Yaga's for a light." "My pins give me a light enough," said the one who was making lace. "I shan't go." "And I shan't go either," said the one who was knitting socks. "My knitting needles give me light enough." "Vasilisa, you must go for the light," they both cried out together. "Be off to the Baba Yaga's." And they pushed Vasilisa out of the room. Vasilisa went into her little closet, set before the doll a supper which she had provided beforehand, and said, "Now, dolly, feed, and listen to my need. I'm sent to the Baba Yaga's for a light. The Baba Yaga will eat me." The doll fed, and its eyes began to glow just like a couple of candles. "Never fear, Vasilisa dear," it said. "Go where you're sent. Only take care to keep me always by you. As long as I'm with you, no harm will come to you at the Baba Yaga's." So Vasilisa got ready, put her doll in her pocket, crossed herself, and went out into the thick forest. As she walked, she trembled. Suddenly a horseman galloped by. He was white, and he was dressed in white. Under him was a white horse, and the trappings of the horse were white. And the day began to break. She went a little further, and a second rider galloped by. He was red, dressed in red, and sitting on a red horse, and the sun rose. Vasilisa went on walking all night and all the next day. It was only toward the evening that she reached the clearing on which stood the dwelling of the Baba Yaga. The fence around it was made of dead men's bones. On the top of the fence were stuck human skulls with eyes in them. Instead of uprights at the gates were men's legs. Instead of bolts were arms. Instead of a lock was a mouth with sharp teeth. Vasilisa was frightened out of her wits and stood still as if rooted to the ground. Suddenly there rode past another horseman. He was black, dressed all in black, and on a black horse. He galloped up to the Baba Yaga's gate and disappeared just as if he had sunk through the ground. And night fell. But the darkness did not last long. The eyes of all the skulls on the fence began to shine, and the whole clearing became as bright as if it had been midday. Vasilisa shuddered with fear, but stopped where she was, not knowing which way to run. Soon there was heard in the forest a terrible roar. The trees cracked. The dry leaves rustled. Out of the forest came the Baba Yaga, riding in a mortar, urging it on with a pestle, sweeping away her traces with a broom. Up she drove to the gate, stopped short, and snuffing the air around her, cried, "Faugh! Faugh! I smell Russian flesh! Who's there?" Vasilisa went up to the hag in a terrible fright, bowed low before her, and said, "It's me, Granny. My stepsisters have sent me to you for a light."
"Very good," said the Baba Yaga. "I know them. If you'll stop a while with me first, and do some work for me, I'll give you a light. But if you won't, I'll eat you."
Then she turned to the gates and cried,
"Ho, thou firm fence of mine, be thou divided, and ye wide gates of mine, do ye fly open."
The gates opened, and the Baba Yaga drove in, whistling as she went, and after her followed Vasilisa, and then everything shut to again. When they entered the sitting room, the Baba Yaga stretched herself out at full length, and said to Vasilisa,
"Fetch out what there is in the oven. I'm hungry."
Vasilisa lighted a splinter at one of the skulls which were on the fence, and began fetching meat from the oven and setting it before the Baba Yaga. And meat enough had been provided for 12 people. Then she fetched from the cellar kvass, meat, beer, and wine. The hag ate up everything, drank up everything. All she left for Vasilisa was a few scraps, a crust of bread, and a morsel of sucking pig. Then the Baba Yaga lay down to sleep, saying,
"When I go out tomorrow morning, mind you cleanse the courtyard, sweep the room, cook the dinner, and get the linen ready. Then go to the corn bin, take out 4 quarters of wheat, and clear it of other seed. And mind you have it all done. If you don't, I shall eat you."
After giving these orders, the Baba Yaga began to snore. But Vasilisa sent the remnants of the hag's supper before her doll, burst into tears, and said, "Now, dolly, feed. Listen to my need. The Baba Yaga has set me a heavy task, and threatens to eat me if I don't do it all. Do help me." The doll replied, "Never fear, Vasilisa the fair. Sup, say your prayers, and go to bed. The morning is wiser than the evening." Vasilisa awoke very early, but the Baba Yaga was already up. She looked out of the window. The light in the skull's eyes was going out. All of a sudden there appeared the white horseman, and all was light. The Baba Yaga went out into the courtyard and whistled. Before her appeared a mortar with a pestle and a broom. The red horseman appeared. The sun rose. The Baba Yaga seated herself in the mortar and drove out of the courtyard, shooting herself along with the pestle, sweeping away her traces with the broom. Vasilisa was left alone, so she examined the Baba Yaga's house, wondered at the abundance there was in everything, and remained lost in thought as to which work she ought to take to first. She looked up. All her work was done already. The doll had cleared the wheat to the very last grain. "Ah, my preserver!" cried Vasilisa. "You've saved me from danger." "All you've got to do now is cook the dinner," answered the doll, slipping into Vasilisa's pocket. "Cook away in God's name, and then take some rest for your health's sake." Towards evening Vasilisa got the table ready and awaited the Baba Yaga. It began to grow dusky. The black rider appeared for a moment at the gate, and all grew dark. Only the eyes of the skulls sent forth their light. The trees began to crack. The leaves began to rustle. Up drove the Baba Yaga. Vasilisa went out to meet her.
"Is everything done?"
asked the Yaga. "Please to look for yourself, Granny," said Vasilisa. The Baba Yaga examined everything, was vexed that there was nothing to be angry about, and said,
"Well, well, very good."
Afterwards she cried,
"My trusty servants, zealous friends, grind this my wheat."
There appeared 3 pairs of hands, which gathered up the wheat and carried it out of sight. The Baba Yaga supped, went to bed, and again gave her orders to Vasilisa.
"Do just the same tomorrow as today, only besides that, take out of the bin the poppy seed that is there, and clean the earth off it grain by grain. Some one or other, you see, has mixed a lot of earth with it out of spite."
Having said this, the hag turned to the wall and began to snore, and Vasilisa took to feeding her doll. The doll fed, and then said to her what it had said the day before. "Pray to God, and go to sleep. The morning is wiser than the evening. All shall be done, Vasilisa dear." The next morning the Baba Yaga again drove out of the courtyard in her mortar, and Vasilisa and her doll immediately did all of the work. The hag returned, looked at everything, and cried,
"My trusty servants, zealous friends, press forth oil from the poppy seed."
3 pairs of hands appeared, gathered up the poppy seed, and bore it out of sight. The Baba Yaga sat down to dinner. She ate, but Vasilisa stood silently by.
"Why don't you speak to me?" said the Baba Yaga. "There you stand like a dumb creature."
"I didn't dare," answered Vasilisa. "But if you give me leave, I should like to ask you about something."
"Ask away. Only it isn't every question that brings good. Get much to know, and old soon you grow."
"I only want to ask you, Granny, about something I saw. As I was coming here, I was passed by one riding on a white horse. He was white himself and dressed in white. Who was he?"
"That was my bright day,"
answered the Baba Yaga. "Afterwards there passed me another rider on a red horse, red himself and all in red clothes. Who was he?"
"That was my red son," answered the Baba Yaga.
"And who may be the black rider, Granny, who passed by me just at your gate?"
"That was my dark knight. They are all trusty servants of mine."
Vasilisa thought of the 3 pairs of hands, but held her peace.
"Why don't you go on asking?"
said the Baba Yaga. "That's enough for me, Granny. You said yourself, get too much to know, old you'll grow."
"It's just as well," said the Baba Yaga, "that you've only asked about what you saw out of doors, not indoors. In my house I hate having dirt carried out of doors, and as to over-inquisitive people, well, I eat them. Now I'll ask you something. How is it you managed to do the work I set you to do?"
"My mother's blessing assists me," replied Vasilisa.
What's that? Get along out of my house, you blessed daughter. I don't want blessed people."
She dragged Vasilisa out of the room, pushed her outside the gates, took one of the skulls with blazing eyes from the fence, stuck it on a stick, gave it to her, and said,
"Lay hold of that. It's a light you can take to your stepsisters. That's what they sent you here for, I believe."
Home went Vasilisa at a run, lit by the skull, which went out only at the approach of the dawn, and at last, on the evening of the 2nd day, she reached home. When she came to the gate, she was going to throw away the skull. "Surely," thought she, "they can't be still in want of a light at home." but suddenly a hollow voice issued from the skull, saying, "Throw me not away. Carry me to your stepmother." She looked at her stepmother's house, and not seeing a light in a single window, she determined to take the skull in there with her. For the first time in her life she was cordially received by her stepmother and stepsisters, who told her that from the moment she went away they hadn't had a spark of fire in the house. They couldn't strike a light themselves anyhow, and whenever they brought one in from a neighbour's it went out as soon as it came into the room.
"Perhaps your light will keep in,"
said the stepmother. So they carried the skull into the sitting-room, but the eyes of the skull so glared at the stepmother and her daughters, shot forth such flames, they would fain have hidden themselves, but run where they would, everywhere did the eyes follow after them. By the morning they were utterly burnt to cinders. Only Vasilisa was none the worse. Next morning Vasilisa buried the skull, locked up the house, and took up her quarters in a neighbouring town. After a time she began to work. Her doll made her a glorious loom, and by the end of the winter she had weaved a quantity of linen so fine that it might be passed like thread through the eye of a needle. In the spring, after it had been bleached, Vasilisa made a present of it to the old woman with whom she lodged. The crone presented it to the king, who ordered it to be made into shirts, but no seamstress could be found to make them up until the linen was entrusted to Vasilisa. When a dozen shirts were ready, Vasilisa sent them to the king, and as soon as her carrier had started, she washed herself and combed her hair and dressed herself and sat down at the window. Before long there arrived a messenger demanding her instant appearance at court, and when she appeared before the royal eyes, the king fell desperately in love with her. "No, my beauty," said he, "never will I part with thee. Thou shalt be my wife." So he married her, and by her father returned and took up his abode with her, and Vasilisa took the old woman into her service. And as for the doll, to the end of her life she always carried it in her pocket. End of Vasilisa the Fair.
The Story of Siavash, Part 1, in Shahnameh, by Ferdowsi. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Story of Siavash, Part 1. Early one morning, as the cock crew, Tous arose, and accompanied by Give and Guders and a company of horsemen, proceeded on a hunting excursion, not far from the banks of the Jehun, where, after ranging about the forest for some time, they happened to fall in with a damsel of extreme beauty, with smiling lips, blossoming cheeks, and fascinating mien. They said to her, "Never was seen so sweet a flower, in garden, vale, or fairy bower. The moon is on thy lovely face, thy cypress form is full of grace. But why, with charms so soft and meek, dost thou the lonely forest seek?" She replied that her father was a violent man, and that she had left her home to escape his anger. She had crossed the river Jehun, and had travelled several leagues on foot, in consequence of her horse being too much fatigued to bear her further. She had at the time been 3 days in the forest. On being questioned respecting her parentage, she said her father's name was Shivar, of the race of Fereydun. Many sovereigns had been suitors for her hand, but she did not approve of one of them. At last he wanted to marry her to Pashang, the ruler of Turan, but she refused him on account of his ugliness and bad temper. This, she said, was the cause of her father's violence, and of her flight from home. But when his angry mood is over, he'll love his daughter as before, and send his horsemen far and near to take me to my mother dear. Therefore I would not further stray, but here without a murmur stay. The hearts of both Tous and Give were equally inflamed with love for the damsel, and each was equally determined to support his own pretensions, in consequence of which a quarrel arose between them. At length it was agreed to refer the matter to the king, and to abide by his decision. When, however, the king beheld the lovely object of contention, he was not disposed to give her to either claimant, but without hesitation took her to himself, after having first ascertained that she was of distinguished family and connection. In due time a son was born to him, who was, according to the calculations of the astrologers, of wonderful promise, and named Siavash. The prophecies about his surprising virtues, and his future renown, made Cavus anxious that justice should be done to his opening talents, and he was highly gratified when Rostam agreed to take him to Zabolestan, and there instruct him in all the accomplishments which were suitable to his illustrious rank. He was accordingly taught horsemanship and archery, how to conduct himself at banquets, how to hunt with the falcon and the leopard, and made familiar with the manners and duty of kings, and the hardy chivalry of the age. His progress in the attainment of every species of knowledge and science was surprising, and in hunting he never stooped to the pursuit of animals inferior to the lion or the tiger. It was not long before the youth felt anxious to pay a visit to his father, and Rostam, willingly complying with his wishes, accompanied his accomplished pupil to the royal court, where they were both received with becoming distinction. Siavash, having fulfilled Cavus's expectations in the highest degree, and the king's gratitude to the champion being in proportion to the eminent merit of his services on the interesting occasion. After this, however, preceptors were continued to enlighten his mind 7 years longer, and then he was emancipated from further application and study. One day, Surabe, the daughter of the Shah of Hamavaran, happening to see Siavash sitting with his father, the beauty of his person made an instantaneous impression on her heart. The fire of love consumed her breast. The thoughts of him denied her rest. For him alone she pined in grief. From him alone she sought relief, and called him to her secret bower to while away the passing hour. But Siavash refused the call. He would not shame his father's hall. The enamoured Surabe, however, was not to be disappointed without further effort, and on a subsequent day she boldly went to the king, and praising the character and attainments of his son, proposed that he should be united in marriage to one of the damsels of royal lineage under her care. For the pretended purpose, therefore, of making his choice, she requested he might be sent to the harem, to see all the ladies and fix on one the most suited to his taste. The king approved of the proposal, and intimated it to Siavash, but Siavash was modest, timid, and bashful, and mentally suspected in this overture some artifice of Surabe. He accordingly hesitated, but the king overcame his scruples, and the youth at length repaired to the Shabastan, as the retired apartments of the women are called, with fear and trembling. When he entered within the precincts of the sacred place, he was surprised by the richness and magnificence of everything that struck his sight. He was delighted with the company of beautiful women, and he observed Surabe sitting on a splendid throne in an interior chamber, like heaven in beauty and loveliness, with a coronet on her head, and her hair floating around her in musky ringlets. Seeing him, she descended gracefully, and clasping him in her arms, kissed his eyes and face with such ardour and enthusiasm that he thought proper to retire from her endearments and mix among the other damsels, who placed him on a golden chair and kept him in agreeable conversation for some time. After this pleasing interview he returned to the king, and gave him a very favourable account of his reception, and the heavenly splendour of the retirement, worthy of Jamshid, Feridun, or Hushang, which gladdened his father's heart. Cavus repeated to him his wish that he would at once choose one of the lights of the harem for his wife, as the astrologers had prophesied on his marriage the birth of a prince. But Siavash endeavoured to excuse himself from going again to Sudaber's apartments. The king smiled at his weakness, and assured him that Sudaber was alone anxious for his happiness, upon which the youth found himself again in her power. She was surrounded by the damsels as before, but whilst his eyes were cast down, they shortly disappeared, leaving him and the enamoured Sudaber together. She soon approached him, and lovingly said, "Oh, why the secret keep from one whose heart is fixed on thee alone? Say who thou art, from whom descended, some peri with a mortal blended. For every maid who sees that face, that cypress form replete with grace, becomes a victim to the wiles which nestle in those dimpled smiles, becomes thy own adoring slave, whom nothing but thy love can save." To this Siavash made no reply. The history of the adventure of Cavus at Hamavaran, and what the king and his warriors endured in consequence of the treachery of the father of Sudaber, flashed upon his mind. He therefore was full of apprehension, and breathed not a word in answer to her fondness. Sudaber, observing his silence and reluctance, threw away from herself the veil of modesty, and said, "Oh, be my own, for I am thine, and clasp me in thy arms." And then she sprang to the astonished boy, and eagerly kissed his deep crimsoned cheek, which filled his soul with strange confusion. "When the king is dead, oh, take me to thyself. See how I stand, body and soul devoted unto thee." In his heart he said, "This can never be. This is a demon's work. Shall I be treacherous? What, to my own dear father? Never, never, I will not thus be tempted by the devil. Yet must I not be cold to this wild woman, for fear of further folly." Siavash then expressed his readiness to be united in marriage to her daughter, and to no other. And when this intelligence was conveyed to Cavus by Sudaber herself, his majesty was extremely pleased, and munificently opened his treasury on the happy occasion. But Sudaber still kept in view her own design, and still labouring for its success, sedulously led her own incantations to prevent disappointment, at any rate to punish the uncomplying youth if she failed. On another day she sent for him, and exclaimed, "I cannot now dissemble. Since I saw thee, I seem to be as dead. My heart's all withered. 7 years have passed in unrequited love. 7 long, long years. Oh, be not still obdurate, but with the generous impulse of affection. Oh, bless my anxious spirit, or, refusing, thy life will be in peril. Thou shalt die." "Never," replied the youth. "Oh, never, never! Oh, ask me not, for this can never be." Siavash then rose to depart precipitately, but Sudaber, observing him, endeavoured to cling round him and arrest his flight. The endeavour, however, was fruitless, and finding at length her situation desperate, she determined to turn the adventure into her own favour by accusing Siavash of an atrocious outrage on her own person and virtue. She accordingly tore her dress, screamed aloud, and rushed out of her apartment to inform Cavus of the indignity she had suffered. Among her women the most clamorous lamentations arose, and echoed on every side. The king, on hearing that Siavash had preferred Sudaber to her daughter, and that he had meditated so abominable an offence, thought that death alone could expiate his crime. He therefore summoned him to his presence, but satisfied that it would be difficult, if not impossible, to ascertain the truth of the case from either party concerned, he had recourse to a test which he thought would be infallible and conclusive. He first smelt the hands of Siavash, and then his garments, which had the scent of rosewater, and then he took the garments of Surabe, which, on the contrary, had a strong flavour of wine and musk. Upon this discovery, the king resolved on the death of Surabe, being convinced of the falsehood of the accusation she had made against his son. But when his indignation subsided, he was induced on various accounts to forego that resolution. Yet he said to her, "I am sure that Siavash is innocent, but let that remain concealed." Surabe, however, persisted in asserting his guilt, and continually urged him to punish the reputed offender, but without being attended to. At length he resolved to ascertain the innocence of Siavash by the ordeal of fire, and the fearless youth prepared to undergo the terrible trial to which he was sentenced, telling his father to be under no alarm. "The truth, and its reward I claim, will bear me safe through fiercest flame." A tremendous fire was accordingly lighted on the adjacent plain, which blazed to an immense distance. The youth was attired in his golden helmet and a white robe, and mounted on a black horse. He put up a prayer to the Almighty for protection, and then rushed amidst the conflagration, as collectedly as if the act had been entirely free from peril. When Surabe heard the confused exclamations that were uttered at that moment, she hurried upon the terrace of the palace, and witnessed the appalling sight, and in the fondness of her heart wished even that she could share his fate, the fate of him of whom she was so deeply enamoured. The king himself fell from his throne in horror on seeing him surrounded and enveloped in the flames, from which there seemed no chance of extrication. But the gallant youth soon rose up, like the moon from the bursting element, and went through the ordeal unharmed and untouched by the fire. Kavus, on coming to his senses, rejoiced exceedingly on the happy occasion, and his severest anger was directed against Surabe, whom he now determined to put to death, not only for her own guilt, but for exposing his son to such imminent danger. The noble youth, however, interceded for her. Surabe, notwithstanding, still continued to practice her charms and incantations in secret, to the end that Siavash might be put out of the way, and in this pursuit she was indeed indefatigable. Suddenly, intelligence was received that Afrasiab had assembled another army for the purpose of making an eruption into Iran, and Kavus, seeing that a Tartar could neither be bound by promise nor oath, resolved that he would on this occasion take the field himself, penetrate as far as Balkh, and, seizing the country, make an example of the inhabitants. But Siavash, perceiving in this prospect of affairs an opportunity of becoming free from the machinations and witchery of Surabe, earnestly requested to be employed, adding that, with the advice and bravery of Rostam, he would be sure of success. The king referred the matter to Rostam, who candidly declared that there was no necessity whatever for his majesty proceeding personally to the war, and upon this assurance he threw open his treasury, and supplied all the resources of the empire to equip the troops appointed to accompany them. After 1 month, the army marched toward Balkh, the point of attack. On the other side, Garsivaz, the ruler of Bulgar, joined the Tartar legions at Balkh, commanded by Barahman, who both sallied forth to oppose the Persian host, and after a conflict of 3 days were defeated and obliged to abandon the fort. When the accounts of this calamity reached Afrasiab, he was seized with the utmost terror, which was increased by a dreadful dream. He thought he was in a forest abounding with serpents, and that the air was darkened by the appearance of countless eagles. The ground was parched up with heat, and a whirlwind hurled down his tent and overthrew his banners. On every side flowed a river of blood, and the whole of his army had been defeated and butchered in his sight. He was afterwards taken prisoner, and ignominiously conducted to Cavus, in whose company he beheld a gallant youth, not more than 14 years of age, who, the moment he saw him, plunged a dagger in his loins, and with the scream of agony produced by the wound, he awoke. Garcivaz had in the meantime returned with the remnant of his force, and being informed of these particulars, endeavoured to console Afrasiab by assuring him that the true interpretation of dreams was the reverse of appearances. But Afrasiab was not to be consoled in this manner. He referred to his astrologers, who, however, hesitated, and were unwilling to afford an explanation of the mysterious vision. At length one of them, upon the solicited promise that the king would not punish him for divulging the truth, discussed the nature of the warning implied in what had been witnessed.
And now I throw aside the veil which hides the darkly shadowed tale. Led by a prince of prosperous star, the Persian legions speed to war, and in his horoscope we scan the lordly victor of Turan. If thou shouldst to the conflict rush, opposed to conquering Siavash, thy Turkish cohorts will be slain, and all thy saving efforts vain. For if he, in the threatened strife, should haply chance to lose his life, thy country's fate will be the same, stripped of its throne and diadem.
Afrasiab was satisfied with this interpretation, and felt the prudence of avoiding a war so pregnant with evil consequences to himself and his kingdom. He therefore deputed Garcivaz to the headquarters of Siavash, with splendid presents, consisting of horses richly caparisoned, armour, swords, and other costly articles, and a written dispatch, proposing a termination to hostilities. In the meantime, Siavash was anxious to pursue the enemy across the Jehun, but was dissuaded by his friends. When Garcivaz arrived on his embassy, he was received with distinction, and the object of his mission being understood, a secret council was held upon what answer should be given. It was then deemed proper to demand, first, 100 distinguished heroes as hostages, and secondly, the restoration of all the provinces which the Turanians had taken from Iran. Garcivaz sent immediately to Afrasiab to inform him of the conditions required, and without the least delay they were approved. 100 warriors were soon on their way, and Bukhara, and Samarkand, and Han, and the Punjab were faithfully delivered over to Siavash. Afrasiab himself retired toward Gangdesh, saying,
I have had a terrible dream, and I will surrender whatever may be required from me, rather than go to war.
The negotiations being concluded, Siavash sent a letter to his father by the hands of Rostam. Rumour, however, had already told Cavus of Afrasiab's dream, and the terror he had been thrown into in consequence. The astrologers in his service having prognosticated from it the certain ruin of the Turanian king, the object of Rostam's mission was directly contrary to the wishes of Cavus, but Rostam contended that the policy was good, and the terms were good, and he thereby incurred his Majesty's displeasure. On this account, Cavus appointed Tus, the leader of the Persian army, and commanded him to march against Afrasiab, ordering Siavash at the same time to return, and bring with him his 100 hostages. At this command, Siavash was grievously offended, and consulted with his chieftains, Bahram and Zinjan and Shahvaran, on the fittest course to be pursued, saying, I have pledged my word to the fulfillment of the terms, and what will the world say if I do not keep my faith? The chiefs tried to quiet his mind, and recommended him to write again to Cavus, expressing his readiness to renew the war and return the 100 hostages. But Siavash was in a different humour, and thought as Tus had been actually appointed to the command of the Persian army, it would be most advisable for him to abandon his country and join Afrasiab. The chiefs, upon hearing this singular resolution, unanimously attempted to dissuade him from pursuing so wild a course as throwing himself into the power of his enemy. But he was deaf to their entreaties, and in the stubbornness of his spirit wrote to Afrasiab, informing him that Cavus had refused to ratify the treaty of peace, that he was compelled to return the hostages, and even himself to seek protection in Turan from the resentment of his father, the warrior Tus having been already entrusted with the charge of the army. This unexpected intelligence excited considerable surprise in the mind of Afrasiab, but he had no hesitation in selecting the course to be followed. The ambassadors, Zinjan and Shahvaran, were soon furnished with a reply, which was to this effect:
I settled the terms of peace with thee, not with thy father. With him I have nothing to do. If thy choice be retirement and tranquillity, thou shalt have a peaceful and independent province allotted to thee. But if war be thy object, I will furnish thee with a large army. Thy father is old and infirm, and with the aid of Rostam, Persia will be an easy conquest.
Having thus obtained the promised favour and support of Afrasiab, Siavash gave in charge to Bahram, the city of Balkh, the army and treasure, in order that they might be delivered over to Tus on his arrival, and taking with him 300 chosen horsemen, passed the Jehun, in progress to the court of Afrasiab. On taking this decisive step, he again wrote to Cavus, saying, From my youth upward I have suffered wrong. At first Surabe, false and treacherous, sought to destroy my happiness and fame, and thou hadst nearly sacrificed my life to glut her vengeance. The astrologers were all unheeded, who pronounced me innocent, and I was doomed to brave devouring fire to testify that I was free from guilt. But God was my deliverer. Victory now has marked my progress. Balkh and all its spoils are mine, and so reduced the enemy that I have gained 100 hostages to guarantee the peace which I have made. And what my recompense? A father's anger which takes me from my glory. Thus deprived of thy affection, whither can I fly? Be it to friend or foe, the will of fate must be my only guide, condemned by thee. The reception of Siavash by Afrasiab was warm and flattering. From the gates of the city to the palace, gold and incense were scattered over his head in the customary manner, and exclamations of welcome uttered on every side. Thy presence gives joy to the land, which awaits thy command. It is thine, it is thine. All the chiefs of the state have assembled to meet thee. All the flowers of the land are in blossom to greet thee. The youth was placed on a golden throne next to Afrasiab, at a magnificent banquet prepared in honour of the stranger, and music and the songs of beautiful women enlivened the festive scene. They chanted the praises of Siavash, distinguished, as they said, among men for 3 things. First, for being of the line of Kegobad; secondly, for his faith and honour; and thirdly, for the wonderful beauty of his person, which had gained universal love and admiration. The favourable sentiments which characterized the first introduction of Siavash to Afrasiab continued to prevail, and indeed the king of Turan seemed to regard him with increased attachment and friendship, as the time passed away, and showed him all the respect and honour to which his royal birth would have entitled him in his own country. After the lapse of a year, Piran Visa, one of Afrasiab's generals, said to him,
Young prince, thou art now high in the favour of the king, and at a great distance from Persia. And thy father is old. Would it not therefore be better for thee to marry, and take up thy residence among us for life?
The suggestion was a rational one, and Siavash readily expressed his acquiescence. Accordingly, the lovely Golshar, who was also named Jarire, having been introduced to him, he was delighted with her person, and both consenting to a union, the marriage ceremony was immediately performed. And many a warm, delicious kiss told how he loved the wedded bliss. Some time after this union, Piran suggested another alliance for the purpose of strengthening his political interest and power, and this was with Ferengis, the daughter of Afrasiab. But Siavash was so devoted to Gulshar that he first consulted with her on the subject, although the hospitality and affection of the king constituted such strong claims on his gratitude that refusal was impossible. Gulshar, however, was a heroine, and willingly sacrificed her own feelings for the good of Siavash, saying she would rather condescend to be the very handmaid of Ferengis than that the happiness and prosperity of her lord should be compromised. The second marriage accordingly took place, and Afrasiab was so pleased with the match that he bestowed on the bride and her husband the sovereignty of Khotan, together with countless treasure in gold and a great number of horses, camels, and elephants. In a short time they proceeded to the seat of the new government. Meanwhile, Kavus suffered the keenest distress and sorrow when he heard of the flight of Siavash into Turan, and Rostam felt such strong indignation at the conduct of the king that he abruptly quitted the court without permission and retired to Sistan. Kavus thus found himself in an embarrassed condition, and deemed it prudent to recall both Tus and the army from Balkh, and relinquish further hostile measures against Afrasiab. The first thing that Siavash undertook after his arrival at Khotan was to order the selection of a beautiful site for his residence, and Piran devoted his services to fulfill that object, exploring all the provinces, hills, and dales on every side. At last he discovered a beautiful spot, at the distance of about a month's journey, which combined all the qualities and advantages required by the anxious prince. It was situated on a mountain, and surrounded by scenery of exquisite richness and variety. The trees were fresh and green, birds warbled on every spray, transparent rivulets murmured through the meadows. The air was neither oppressively hot in summer nor cold in winter, so that the temperature and the attractive objects which presented themselves at every glance seemed to realize the imagined charms and fascinations of paradise. The inhabitants enjoyed perpetual health, and every breeze was laden with music and perfume. So lovely a place could not fail to yield pleasure to Siavash, who immediately set about building a palace there, and garden temples, in which he had pictures painted of the most remarkable persons of his time, and also the portraits of ancient kings. The walls were decorated with the likenesses of Keigobad, Kavus, Pashang, Afrasiab, and Sam, and Zal, and Rostam, and other champions of Persia and Turan. When completed, it was a gorgeous retreat, and the sight of it sufficient to give youthful vigour to the withered faculties of age. And yet Siavash was not happy. Tears started into his eyes, and sorrow weighed upon his heart, whenever he thought upon his own estrangement from home. It happened that the lovely Gulshar, who had been left in the house of her father, was delivered of a son in due time, and he was named Forud. Afrasiab, on being informed of the proceedings of Siavash, and of the heart-expanding residence he had chosen, was highly gratified, and to show his affectionate regard, dispatched to him with the intelligence of the birth of a son, presents of great value and variety, Garsivas, the brother of Afrasiab, and who had from the first looked upon Siavash with a jealous and malignant eye, being afraid of his interfering with his own prospects in Turan, was the person sent on this occasion. But he hid his secret doubts under the veil of outward praise and approbation. Siavash was pleased with the intelligence and the presents, but failed to pay the customary respect to Garsivas on his arrival, and in consequence the lurking indignation and hatred
formerly felt by the latter were considerably augmented.
The attention of Siavash respecting his army and the concerns of the state was unremitting, and noted by the visitor with a jealous and scrutinizing eye, so that Garsivas, on his return to the court of Afrasiab, artfully talked much of the pomp and splendor of the prince, and added,
Siavash is far from being the amiable character thou hast supposed. He is artful and ambitious, and he has collected an immense army. He is in fact dissatisfied. As a proof of his haughtiness, he paid me but little attention, and doubtless very heavy calamity will soon befall Turan, should he break out, as I apprehend he will, into open rebellion. For he is proud, and thou hast yet to learn the temper of thy daughter Ferengis, now bound to him in duty and affection. Their purpose is the same, to overthrow the kingdom of Turan and thy dominion, to merge the glory of this happy realm into the Persian Empire.
But plausible and persuasive as were the observations and positive declarations of Garsivas, Afrasiab would not believe the imputed ingratitude and hostility of Siavash.
He has sought my protection, said he. He has thrown himself upon my generosity, and I cannot think him treacherous. But if he has meditated anything unmerited by me, and unworthy of himself, it will be better to send him back to Caecavus, his father.
The artful Garsivas, however, was not to be diverted from his object. He said that Siavash had become personally acquainted with Turan, its position, its weakness, its strength and resources, and aided by Rostam, would soon be able to overrun the country if he was suffered to return, and therefore he recommended Afrasiab to bring him from Khotan by some artifice, and secure him. In conformity with this suggestion, Garsivas was again deputed to the young prince, and a letter of a friendly nature written for the purpose of blinding him to the real intentions of his father-in-law. The letter was no sooner read than Siavash expressed his desire to comply with the request contained in it, saying that Afrasiab had been a father to him, and that he would lose no time in fulfilling in all respects the wishes he had received. This compliance and promptitude, however, was not in harmony with the sinister views of Garsivas, for he foresaw that the very fact of answering the call immediately would show that some misrepresentation had been practised, and consequently it was his business now to promote procrastination, and an appearance of evasive delay. He therefore said to him privately that it would be advisable for him to wait a little, and not manifest such implicit obedience to the will of Afrasiab. But Siavash replied that both his duty and affection urged him to a ready compliance. Then Garsivas pressed him more warmly, and represented how inconsistent, how unworthy of his illustrious lineage it would be to betray so meek a spirit, especially as he had a considerable army at his command, and could vindicate his dignity and his rights. And he addressed to him these specious arguments so incessantly and with such earnestness that the deluded prince was at last induced to put off his departure, on account of his wife Ferengis pretending that she was ill, and saying that the moment she was better he would return to Turan. This was quite enough for treachery to work upon, and as soon as the dispatch was sealed, Garsivas conveyed it with the utmost expedition to Afrasiab. Appearances, at least, were thus made strong against Siavash, and the tyrant of Turan, now easily convinced of his falsehood, and feeling in consequence his former enmity renewed, forthwith assembled an army to punish his refractory son-in-law. Garsivas was appointed the leader of that army, which was put in motion without delay against the unoffending youth. The news of Afrasiab's warlike preparations satisfied the mind of Siavash that Garsivas had given him good advice, and that he had been a faithful monitor, for immediate compliance, he now concluded, would have been his utter ruin. When he communicated this unwelcome intelligence to Ferengis, she was thrown into the greatest alarm and agitation, but ever fruitful in expedients, suggested the course that it seemed necessary he should instantly adopt, which was to fly by a circuitous route back to Iran. To this he expressed no dissent, provided she would accompany him. But she said it was impossible to do so on account of the condition she was in. "Leave me," she added, "and save thy own life." He therefore called together his 300 Iranians, and requesting Ferengis, if she happened to be delivered of a son, to call him Khosrow, set off on his journey. I go, surrounded by my enemies, the hand of merciless Afrasiab lifted against me. It was not the fortune of Siavash, however, to escape so easily as had been anticipated by Ferengis. Garsivas was soon at his heels, and in the battle that ensued all the Iranians were killed, and also the horse upon which the unfortunate prince rode, so that on foot he could make but little progress. In the meantime, Afrasiab came up, and surrounding him, wanted to shoot him with an arrow, but he was restrained from the violent act by the intercession of his people, who recommended his being taken alive, and only kept in prison. Accordingly, he was again attacked and secured, but still Afrasiab wished to put him to death. But Pilsam, one of his warriors, and the brother of Piran, induced him to relinquish that diabolical intention, and to convey him back to his own palace. Siavash was then ignominiously fettered, and conducted to the royal residence, which he had himself erected and ornamented with such richness and magnificence. The sight of the city and its splendid buildings filled everyone with wonder and admiration. Upon the arrival of Afrasiab, Ferengis hastened to him in a state of the deepest distress, and implored his clemency and compassion in favour of Siavash. "O father, he is not to blame. Still pure and spotless is his name, faithful and generous still to me, and never, never false to thee. This hate to Garsivas he owes, the worst, the bitterest of his foes. Did he not thy protection seek, and wilt thou overpower the weak? Spill royal blood thou shouldst bless, in cruel sport and wantonness, and earn the curses of mankind, living in this precarious state, and dead the torments of the mind, which hell inflicts upon the great, who revel in a murderous curse, and rule by cruelty and force. It scarce becomes me now to tell what the accursed Zahak befell, or what the punishment which hurled Salm and Tur from out the world. And is not Kavus living now, with rightful vengeance on his brow, and Rostam, who alone can make thy kingdom to its centre quake? Gutars, Zurara, and Feribors, and Tus, and Gorgin, and Faramars, and others too of fearless might, to challenge thee to mortal fight. O, from this peril turn away, cease not in gloom so bright a day. Some heed to thy poor daughter give, and let thy guiltless captive live." The effect of this appeal, solemnly and urgently delivered, was only transitory. Afrasiab felt a little compunction at the moment, but soon resumed his ferocious spirit, and to ensure, without interruption, the accomplishment of his purpose, confined Ferengis in one of the remotest parts of the palace. And thus to Garsivas the unfeeling spoke.
"Off with his head, down with the enemy, but take especial notice that his blood stains not the earth, lest it should cry aloud for vengeance on us. Take good care of that."
Garsivas, who was but too ready an instrument, immediately directed Garvizare, a kinsman of Afrasiab, who had been also one of the most zealous in promoting the ruin of the Persian prince, to inflict the deadly blow, and Siavash, whilst under the grasp of the executioner, had but time to put up a prayer to heaven, in which he hoped that a son might be born to him to vindicate his good name, and be revenged on his murderer. The executioner then seized him by the hair, and throwing him on the ground, severed the head from the body. A golden vessel was ready to receive the blood, as commanded by Afrasiab, but a few drops happened to be spilt on the soil, and upon that spot a tree grew up, which was afterwards called Siavash, and believed to possess many wonderful virtues. The blood was carefully conveyed to Afrasiab, the head fixed on the point of a javelin, and the body was buried with respect and affection by his friend Pilsam, who had witnessed the melancholy catastrophe. It is also related that a tremendous tempest occurred at the time this amiable prince was murdered, and that a total darkness covered the face of the earth, so that the people could not distinguish each other's faces. Then was the name of Afrasiab truly execrated and abhorred for the cruel act he had committed, and all the inhabitants of Khotan long cherished the memory of Siavash. Ferengis was frantic with grief when she was told of the sad fate of her husband, and all her household uttered the loudest lamentations. Pilsam gave the intelligence to Piran, and the proverb was then remembered, "It is better to be in hell than under the rule of Afrasiab." When the deep sorrow of Ferengis reached the ears of her father, he determined on a summary procedure, and ordered Garsivas to have her privately made away with, so that there might be no issue of her marriage with Siavash. Piran, with horror, heard this stern command, and hastened to the king, and thus addressed him. "What? Wouldst thou hurl thy vengeance on a woman, that woman too thy daughter? Is it wise or natural thus to sport with human life? Already hast thou taken from her arms her unoffending husband. That was cruel. But thus to shed an innocent woman's blood, and kill her unborn infant, that would be too dreadful to imagine. Is she not thy own fair daughter, given in happier time to him who won thy favour and affection? Think but of that, and from thy heart root out this demon wish, which leads thee to a crime, mocking concealment. Vain were the endeavour to keep the murder secret, and when known, the world's opprobrium would pursue thy name. And after death, what would thy portion be? No more of this. Honour me with the charge, and I will keep her with a father's care in my own mansion." Then Afrasiab readily answered, "Take her to thy home, but when the child is born, let it be brought promptly to me. My will must be obeyed." Piran rejoiced at his success, and assenting to the command of Afrasiab, took Ferengis with him to Khotan, where in due time a child was born, and being a son, was named Khosro. As soon as he was born, Piran took measures to prevent his being carried off to Afrasiab, and committed him to the care of some peasants on the mountain Gala. On the same night Afrasiab had a dream, in which he received intimation of the birth of Khosro, and upon this intimation he sent for Piran to know why his commands had not been complied with. Piran replied that he had cast away the child in the wilderness. "And why was he not sent to me?" inquired the despot. "Because," said Piran, "I considered thy own future happiness. Thou hast unjustly killed the father, and God forbid that thou shouldst also kill the son." Afrasiab was abashed, and it is said that ever after the atrocious murder of Siavash, he had been tormented with the most terrible and harrowing dreams. Garsivas now became hateful to his sight, and he began at last deeply to repent of his violence and inhumanity. Khosro grew up under the fostering protection of the peasants, and showed early marks of surprising talent and activity. He excelled in manly exercises, and hunting ferocious animals was his peculiar delight. Instructors had been provided to initiate him in all the arts and pursuits cultivated by the warriors of those days. and even in his 12th year accounts were forwarded to Piran of several wonderful feats which he had performed. Then smiled the good old man, and joyful said,
"'Tis ever thus. The youth of royal blood will not disgrace his lineage, but betray by his superior mien and gallant deeds from whence he sprung. 'Tis by the luscious fruit we know the tree, and glory in its ripeness."
Piran could not resist paying a visit to the youth in his mountainous retreat, and, happy to find him, beyond all expectation, distinguished for the elegance of his external appearance and the superior qualities of his mind, related to him the circumstances under which he had been exposed, and the rank and misfortunes of his father. An artifice then occurred to him which promised to be of ultimate advantage. He afterwards told Afrasiab that the offspring of Ferengis, thrown by him into the wilderness to perish, had been found by a peasant and brought up, but that he understood the boy was little better than an idiot. Afrasiab, upon this information, desired that he might be sent for, and in the meantime Piran took especial care to instruct Caghosro how he should act, which was to seem in all respects insane, and he accordingly appeared before the king in the dress of a prince with a golden crown on his head, and the royal girdle round his loins. Caghosro proceeded on horseback to the court of Afrasiab, and having performed the usual salutations, was suitably received, though with strong feelings of shame and remorse on the part of the tyrant. Afrasiab put several questions to him, which were answered in a wild and incoherent manner, entirely at variance with the subject proposed. The king could not help smiling, and supposing him to be totally deranged, allowed him to be sent with presents to his mother, for no harm, he thought, could possibly be apprehended from one so forlorn in mind. Piran triumphed in the success of his scheme, and lost no time in taking Caghosro to his mother. All the people of Khotan poured blessings on the head of the youth, and imprecations on the merciless spirit of Afrasiab. The city, built by Siavash, had been razed to the ground by the exterminating fury of his enemies, and wild animals and reptiles occupied the place on which it stood. The mother and son visited the spot where Siavash was barbarously killed, and the tree, which grew up from the soil enriched by his blood, was found verdant and flourishing, and continued to possess in perfection its marvellous virtues. The tale of Siavash is told, and now the pages bright unfold. Rostam's revenge, Surabe's fate, Afrasiab's degraded state, and that terrific curse and ban which fell at last upon Turan. End of the story of Siavash, Part 1, by Ferdowsi. The story of Siavash, Part 2, in Shahnameh, by Ferdowsi. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The story of Siavash, Part 2. When Caecavus heard the fate of his son, and all its horrible details were pictured to his mind, he was thrown into the deepest affliction. His warriors, Tus and Gudars and Bahram and Faribors and Farhad, felt with equal keenness the loss of the amiable prince, and Rostam, as soon as the dreadful intelligence reached Sistan, set off with his troops to the court of the king, still full of indignation at the conduct of Kavus, and oppressed with sorrow respecting the calamity which had occurred. On his arrival, he thus addressed the weeping and disconsolate father of Siavash, himself at the same time drowned in tears. How has thy temper turned to naught, the seed which might have grown and cast a glorious shadow? How it is scattered to the barren winds! Thy love for false Surabe was the case of all this misery.
she, the sorceress over whom thou hast so oft in rapture hung, enchanted by her charms, she was the cause of this destruction. Thou art woman's slave, woman the bane of man's felicity. Whoever trusted woman, death were better than being under woman's influence. She places man upon the foamy ridge of the tempestuous wave, which rolls to ruin. Whoever trusted woman, woman, woman!
Cavus looked down with melancholy mien, and, half consenting, thus to Rostam said, Surabe's blandishments absorb my soul, and she has brought this wretchedness upon me. Rostam rejoined, The world must be revenged upon this false Surabe. She must die. Cavus was silent, but his tears flowed fast, and shame withheld resistance. Rostam rushed without a pause towards the Shabastan. Impatient, nothing could obstruct his speed to slay Surabe. Her he quickly found, and rapidly his sanguinary sword performed its office. Thus the sorceress died. Such was the punishment her crimes received. Having thus accomplished the first part of his vengeance, he proceeded with the Persian army against Afrasiab, and all the Iranian warriors followed his example. When he had penetrated as far as Turan, the enemy sent forward 30,000 men to oppose his progress, and in the conflict which ensued, Faramaz took Sarkha, the son of Afrasiab, prisoner. Rostam delivered him over to Tus to be put to death precisely in the same manner as Siavash, but the captive represented himself as the particular friend of Siavash, and begged to be pardoned on that account. Rostam, however, had sworn that he would take his revenge without pity or remorse, and accordingly death was inflicted upon the unhappy prisoner, whose blood was received in a dish and sent to Cavus, and the severed head suspended over the gates of the king's palace. Afrasiab, hearing of this catastrophe, which sealed the fate of his favourite son, immediately collected together the whole of the Turanian army, and hastened himself to resist the conquering career of the enemy. As on they moved, with loud and dissonant clang, his numerous troops shut out the prospect round. No sun was visible by day, no moon nor stars by night. The tramp of men and steeds, and rattling drums and shouts, were only heard, and the bright gleams of armour only seen. Ere long the two armies met, when Pilsam, the brother of Piran, was ambitious of opposing his single arm against Rostam, upon which Afrasiab said, Subdue Rostam, and thy reward shall be my daughter, and half my kingdom. Piran, however, observed that he was too young to be a fit match for the experience and valour of the Persian champion, and would have dissuaded him from the unequal contest. But the choice was his own, and he was consequently permitted by Afrasiab to put his bravery to the test. Pilsam accordingly went forth and summoned Rostam to the fight, but Giv, hearing the call, accepted the challenge himself, and had nearly been thrown from his horse by the superior activity of his opponent. Faramaz luckily saw him at the perilous moment, and darting forward, with one stroke of his sword, shattered Pilsam's javelin to pieces. And then a new strife began. Pilsam and Faramaz fought together with desperation, till both were almost exhausted, and Rostam himself was surprised to see the display of so much valour. Perceiving the wearied state of the two warriors, he pushed forward Raksh, and called aloud to Pilsam, Am I not the person challenged? And immediately the Turanian chief proceeded to encounter him, striking with all his might at the head of the champion. But though the sword was broken by the blow, not a hair of his head was disordered. Then Rostam, urging on his gallant steed, fixed his long javelin in the girdle band of his ambitious foe, and quick unhorsed him, then dragged him on towards Afrasiab, and, scoffing, cast him at the despot's feet. "Here comes the glorious conqueror," he said. "Now give to him thy daughter and thy treasure, thy kingdom and thy soldiers. Has he not done honour to thy country? Is he not a jewel in thy crown of sovereignty? What arrogance inspired the fruitless hope? Think of thy treachery to Siavash, thy savage cruelty, and never look for aught but deadly hatred from mankind. And in the field of fight, defeat and ruin." Thus scornfully he spoke, and not a man, though in the presence of Afrasiab, had soul to meet him. Fear overcame them all, monarch and warriors, for a time. At length shame was awakened, and the king appeared in arms against the champion. Fiercely they hurled their sharp javelins. Rostam's struck the head of his opponent's horse, which floundering fell, and overturned his rider. Anxious then, the champion sprang to seize the royal prize, but Human rushed between and saved his master, who vaulted on another horse and fled. Having thus rescued Afrasiab, the wary chief exercised all his cunning and adroitness to escape himself, and at last succeeded. Rostam pursued him and the Turanian troops, who had followed the example of the king. But though thousands were slain in the chase which continued for many farsangs, no further advantage was obtained on that day. Next morning, however, Rostam resumed his pursuit, and the enemy, hearing of his approach, retreated into Chinese Tartary to secure, among other advantages, the person of Kay Khosrow, leaving the kingdom of Turan at the mercy of the invader, who mounted the throne and ruled there, it is said, about 7 years with memorable severity, prescribing and putting to death every person who mentioned the name of Afrasiab. In the meantime, he made splendid presents to Tus and Gudaus, suitable to their rank and services, and Zavara, in revenge for the monstrous outrage committed upon Siavash, burnt and destroyed everything that came in his way, his wrath being exasperated by the sight of the places in which the young prince had resided, and recreated himself with hunting and other sports of the field. The whole realm, in fact, was delivered over to plunder and devastation, and every individual of the army was enriched by the appropriation of public and private wealth. The companions of Rostam, however, grew weary of residing in Turan, and they strongly represented to him the neglect which Kay Kavus had suffered for so many years, recommending his return to Persia as being more honourable than the exile they endured in an ungenial climate. Rostam's abandonment of the kingdom was at length carried into effect, and he and his warriors did not fail to take away with them all the immense property that remained in jewels and gold, part of which was conveyed by the champion to Zabul and Sistan, and a goodly proportion to the king of kings in Persia. When to Afrasiab was known the plunder of his realm and throne, that the destroyer's reckless hand with fire and sword had scathed the land, sorrow and anguish filled his soul, and passion raged beyond control. And thus he to his warriors said, "At such a time is valor dead? The man who hears the mournful tale, and is not by his country's bale urged on to vengeance, cannot be of woman born. Accursed is he. The time will come when I shall reap the harvest of resentment deep, and till arrives that fated hour, farewell to joy in hall or bower." Rostam, in taking revenge for the murder of Siavash, had not been unmindful of Kay Khosrow, and had actually sent to the remote parts of Tartary in quest of him. It is said that Gudaus beheld in a dream the young prince, who pointed out to him his actual residence, and intimated that of all the warriors of Kavus, Give was the only one destined to restore him to the world and his birthright. The old man immediately requested his son Give to go to the place where the stranger would be found. Give readily complied, and in his progress provided himself at every stage successively with a guide, whom he afterwards slew to prevent discovery, and in this manner he proceeded till he reached the boundary of Chin, enjoying no comfort by day or sleep by night. His only food was the flesh of the wild ass, and his only covering the skin of the same animal. He went on traversing mountain and forest, enduring every privation, and often did he hesitate, often did he think of returning, but honour urged him forward in spite of the trouble and impediments with which he was continually assailed. Arriving in a desert one day, he happened to meet with several persons, who, upon being interrogated, said that they were sent by Piran Visa in search of Kay Kavus. Give kept his own secret, saying that he was amusing himself with hunting the wild ass, but took care to ascertain from them the direction in which they were going. During the night the parties separated, and in the morning Give proceeded rapidly on his route, and after some time discovered a youth sitting by the side of a fountain, with a cup in his hand, whom he supposed to be Kay Khosrow. The youth also spontaneously thought, "This must be Give," and when the traveller approached him and said, "I am sure thou art the son of Siavash," the youth observed, "I am equally sure that thou art Give, the son of Gudars." At this Give was amazed, and falling to his feet, asked how and from what circumstance he recognized him. The youth replied that he knew all the warriors of Kavus, Rostam and Kashvad and Tus and Gudars and the rest, from their portraits in his father's gallery, they being deeply impressed on his mind. He then asked in what way Give had discovered him to be Kay Khosrow, and Give answered, "Because I perceived something kingly in thy countenance. But let me again examine thee." The youth at this request removed his garments, and Give beheld that mark on his body which was the heritage of the race of Kay Gobard. Upon this discovery he rejoiced, and congratulating himself and the young prince on the success of his mission, related to him the purpose for which he had come. Kay Khosrow was soon mounted on horseback, and Give accompanied him respectfully on foot. They, in the first instance, pursued their way towards the abode of Farangis, his mother. The persons sent by Piran Visa did not arrive at the place where Kay Khosrow had been kept till long after Give and the prince departed, and then they were told that a Persian horseman had come and carried off the youth, upon which they immediately returned, and communicated to Piran what had occurred. Farangis, in recovering her son, mentioned to Give, with the fondness of a mother, the absolute necessity of going on without delay, and pointed out to him the meadow in which some of Afrasiab's horses were to be met with, particularly one called Bethzad, which once belonged to Siavash, and which her father had kept in good condition for his own riding. Give, therefore, went to the meadow, and throwing his command, secured Bethzad and another horse, and all three being thus accommodated, hastily proceeded on their journey towards Iran. Tidings of the escape of Kay Khosrow having reached Afrasiab, he dispatched Kolbad with 300 horsemen after him, and so rapid were his movements that he overtook the fugitives in the vicinity of Bulgaria. Khosrow and his mother were asleep, but Give, being awake, and seeing an armed force evidently in pursuit of his party, boldly put on his armour, mounted Bethzad, and before the enemy came up, advanced to the charge. He attacked the horsemen furiously with sword and mace, for he had heard the prophecy which declared that Kay Khosrow was destined to be the king of kings, and therefore he braved the direst peril with confidence and the certainty of success. It was this feeling which enabled him to perform such a prodigy of valour in putting Kolbad and his 300 horsemen to the rout. They all fled defeated, and dispersed precipitately before him. After this surprising victory, he returned to the halting place, and told Cé Chosroe what he had done. The prince was disappointed at not having been awakened to participate in the exploit, but Guy said, "I did not wish to disturb thy sweet slumbers unnecessarily. It was thy good fortune and prosperous star, however, which made me triumph over the enemy." The three travellers then resuming their journey. Through dreary track and pathless waste, and wood and wild, their way they traced. The return of the defeated Colbard excited the greatest indignation in the breast of Pyrrhon.
"What? 300 soldiers to fly from the valour of one man? Had Guy possessed even the activity and might of Rostam and Sam, such a shameful discomfiture could scarcely have happened."
Saying this, he ordered the whole force under his command to be got ready, and set off himself to overtake and intercept the fugitives, who, fatigued with the toilsome march, were only able to proceed one stage in the day. Pyrrhon, therefore, who had travelled at the rate of 100 leagues a day, overtook them before they had passed through Bulgaria. Ferengis, who saw the enemy's banner floating in the air, knew that it belonged to Pyrrhon, and instantly awoke the two young men from sleep. Upon this occasion, Chosroe insisted on acting his part, instead of being left ignominiously idle. But Guy was still resolute, and determined to preserve him from all risk at the peril of his own life. "Thou art destined to be the king of the world. Thou art yet young and a novice, and hast never known the toils of war. Heaven forbid that any misfortune should befall thee. Indeed, whilst I live, I will never suffer thee to go into battle." Chosroe then proposed to give him assistance, but Guy said he wanted no assistance, not even from Rostam. "For," he added, "in art and strength we are equal, having frequently tried our skill together." Rostam had given his daughter in marriage to Guy, he himself being married to Guy's sister. "Be of good cheer," resumed he. "Get upon some high place and witness the battle between us. Fortune will still from heaven descend. The god of victory is my friend." As soon as he took the field, Pyrrhon thus addressed him: "Thou hast once singly defeated 300 of my soldiers. Thou shalt now see what punishment awaits thee at my hands. For should a warrior be a rock of steel, 1,000 ants, gathered on every side, in time will make him but a heap of dust." In reply, Guy said to Pyrrhon, "I am the man who bound thy 2 women, and sent them from China to Persia. Rostam and I are the same in battle. Thou knowest, when he encountered 1,000 horsemen, what was the result, and what he accomplished. Thou wilt find me the same. Is not a lion enough to overthrow 1,000 kids? If but a man survive of thy proud host, brand me with coward. Say I'm not a warrior. Already I have triumphed over Colbard, and now I'll take thee prisoner, yea, alive, and send thee to Cavus. There thou wilt be slain to avenge the death of Siavash. Turan shall perish, and Afrasiab, and every earthly hope extinguished quite." Hearing this awful threat, Pyrrhon turned pale, and shook with terror, trembling like a reed, and saying, "Go, I will not fight with thee." But Guy asked fiercely, "Why?" And on he rushed against the foe who fled, but 'twas in vain. The command round the old man's neck was thrown, and he was taken captive. Then his troops showered their sharp arrows on triumphant Guy to free their master, who was quickly brought before Cé Chosroe, and the command placed within his royal hands. This service done, Guy sped against the Tartars, and full soon defeated and dispersed them. On his return, Guy expressed his astonishment that Pyrrhon was still alive, when Ferengis interposed, and weeping, said how much she had been indebted to his interposition, and the most active humanity on various occasions, and particularly in saving herself and Cei Khosrow from the wrath of Afrasiab after the death of Siavash. If, said she, after so much generosity he has committed one fault, let it be forgiven. Let not the man of many virtues die for being guilty of one trifling error. Let not the friend who nobly saved my life, and more, the dearer life of Cei Khosrow, suffer from us. Oh, he must never, never feel the sharp pang of foul ingratitude from a true prince of the Kianian race. But Giv paused and said, I have sworn to crimson the earth with his blood, and I must not pass from my oath. Khosrow then suggested to him to pierce the lobes of Piran's ears and drop the blood on the ground to stain it, in order that he might not depart from this world, and this humane fraud was accordingly committed. Khosrow further interceded, and instead of being sent a captive to Kavus, the good old man was set at liberty. When the particulars of this event were described to Afrasiab by Piran Vizar, he was exceedingly sorrowful, and lamented deeply that Cei Khosrow had so successfully effected his escape. But he had recourse to a further expedient, and sent instructions to all the ferrymen of the Jehun, with a minute description of the three travellers, to prevent their passing that river, announcing at the same time that he himself was in pursuit of them. Not a moment was lost in preparing his army for the march, and he moved forward with the utmost expedition, night and day. At the period when Giv arrived on the banks of the Jehun, the stream was very rapid and formidable, and he requested the ferrymen to produce their certificates to show themselves equal to their duty. They pretended that their certificates were lost, but demanded for their fare the black horse upon which Giv rode. Giv replied that he could not part with his favourite horse, and they rejoined, Then give us the damsel who accompanies you. Giv answered and said, This is not a damsel, but the mother of that youth. Then, observed they, give us the youth's crown. But Giv told them that he could not comply with their demand, yet he was ready to reward them with money to any extent. The pertinacious ferrymen, who were not anxious for money, then demanded his armour, and this was also refused, and such was their independence or their effrontery, that they replied, If not one of these 4 things you are disposed to grant, cross the river as best you may. Giv whispered to Cei Khosrow, and told him that there was no time for delay. When Kaveh, the blacksmith, said he, rescued thy great ancestor Feridun, he passed the stream in his armour without impediment, and why should we, in a cause of equal glory, hesitate for a moment? Under the inspiring influence of an auspicious omen, and confiding in the protection of the Almighty, Cei Khosrow at once impelled his foaming horse into the river. His mother, Ferengis, followed with equal intrepidity, and then Giv, and, notwithstanding the perilous passage, they all successfully overcame the boiling surge, and landed in safety, to the utter amazement of the ferrymen, who of course had expected that they would be drowned. It so happened that at the moment they touched the shore, Afrasiab with his army arrived, and had the mortification to see the fugitives on the other bank, beyond his reach. His wonder was equal to his disappointment.
What spirits must they have to brave the terrors of that boiling wave, with steed and harness riding over the billows to the further shore?
It was a cheering sight, they say, to see how well they kept their way, how Ferengis impelled her horse across that awful torrent's course, guiding him with heroic hand to reach unhurt the friendly strand. Afrasiab continued for some time mute with astonishment and vexation, and when he recovered, ordered the ferrymen to get ready their boats to pass him over the river. But Human dissuaded him from that measure, saying that they could only convey a few troops, and they would doubtless be received by a large force of the enemy on the other side. At these words, Afrasiab seemed to devour his own blood with grief and indignation, and immediately retracing his steps, returned to Turan. As soon as Give entered within the boundary of the Persian Empire, he poured out thanksgivings to God for his protection, and sent intelligence to Kavus of the safe arrival of the party in his dominions. The king rejoiced exceedingly, and appointed an honorary deputation under the direction of Gudars to meet the young prince on the road. On first seeing him, the king moved forward to receive him, and, weeping affectionately, kissed his eyes and face, and had a throne prepared for him exactly like his own, upon which he seated him, and calling the nobles and warriors of the land together, commanded them to obey him. All readily promised their allegiance, excepting Tus, who left the court in disgust, and repairing forthwith to the house of Pharibors, one of the sons of Kavus, told him that he would only pay homage and obedience to him, and not to the infant whom Give had just brought out of a desert. Next day, the great men and leaders were again assembled to declare publicly by an official act their fealty to Kay Khosrow, and Tus was also invited to the banquet, which was held on the occasion, but he refused to go. Give was deputed to repeat the invitation, and he then said, "I shall pay homage to Pharibors as the heir to the throne, and to no other. For is he not the son of Kay-Kavus, and worthy of the regal crown and throne? I want not any of the race of Pashang, none of the proud Turanian dynasty. Fruitless has been thy peril, Give, to bring a silly child among us, to defraud the rightful prince of his inheritance." Give, in reply, vindicated the character and attainments of Khosrow, but Tus was not to be appeased. He therefore returned to his father and communicated to him what had occurred. Gudars was roused to great wrath by this resistance to the will of the king, and at once took 12,000 men and his 78 kinsmen, together with Give, and proceeded to support his cause by force of arms. Tus, apprised of his intentions, prepared to meet him, but was reluctant to commit himself by engaging in a civil war, and said internally, "If I unsheath the sword of strife, numbers on either side will fall. I would not sacrifice the life of one who owns my sovereign's thrall. My country would abhor the deed, and may I never see the hour when Persia's sons are doomed to bleed, but when opposed to foreign power. The cause must be both good and true, and if their blood in war must flow, will it not seem of brighter hue when shed to crush the Tartar foe?" Possessing these sentiments, Tus sent an envoy to Gudars, suggesting the suspension of any hostile proceedings until information on the subject had first been communicated to the king. Kavus was extremely displeased with Gudars for his precipitancy and folly, and directed both him and Tus to repair immediately to court. Tus there said frankly, "I now owe honor and allegiance to King Kavus, but should he happen to lay aside the throne and the diadem, my obedience and loyalty will be due to Pharibors, his heir, and not to a stranger." To this Gudars replied, "Siavash was the eldest son of the king, and unjustly murdered, and therefore it becomes his majesty to appease and rejoice the soul of the deceased by putting Khosrow in his place. Khosrow, like Feridun, is worthy of empire. All the nobles of the land are of this opinion, excepting thyself, which must arise from ignorance and vanity. From no Tsar certainly thou art descended, not from a stranger, not from foreign loins. But though thy ancestor was wise and mighty, art thou of equal merit? No, not thou. Regarding Khosrow, thou hast neither shown reason nor sense, but most surprising folly. To this contemptuous speech, Tus thus replied,
Ungenerous warrior, wherefore thus employ such scornful words to me? Who art thou, pray? Who but the low descendant of a blacksmith? No Khosrow claims thee for his son, no chief of noble blood, whilst I can truly boast kindred to princes of the highest worth, and merit not to be obscured by thee.
To him then Gudaz, Hear me for this once, then shut thy ears for ever. Need I blush to be the kinsman of the glorious Kaveh? It is my humour to be proud of him. Although he was a blacksmith, that same man who, when the world could still boast of valour, tore up the name-roll of the fiend Sahak, and gave the Persians freedom from the fangs of the devouring serpents. He it was who raised the banner and proclaimed aloud, Freedom for Persia. Need I blush for him? To him the empire owes its greatest blessing, the prosperous rule of virtuous Feridun. Tus wrathfully rejoined, Old man, thy arrow may pierce an anvil. Mine can pierce the heart of the Kaf mountain. If thy mace can break a rock asunder, mine can strike the sun. The anger of the two heroes beginning to exceed all proper bounds, Kavus commanded silence. When Gudaz came forward and asked permission to say one word more, Call Khosrow and Fariboz before thee, and decide impartially between them which is the most worthy of sovereignty. Let the wisest and the bravest only be thy successor to the throne of Persia. Kavus replied, The father has no choice among his children. He loves them all alike. His only care is to prevent disunion, to preserve brotherly kindness and respect among them. After a pause, he requested the attendance of Fariboz and Khosrow, and told them that there was a demon fortress in the vicinity of his dominions called Bahman, from which fire was continually issuing. Go, each of you, said he, against this fortress, supported by an army with which you shall be equally provided, and the conqueror shall be sovereign of Persia. Fariboz was not sorry to hear of this probationary scheme, and only solicited to be sent first on the expedition. He and Tus looked upon the task as perfectly easy, and promised to be back triumphant in a short time. But when the army reached that awful fort, the ground seemed all in flames on every side. One universal fire raged round and round, and the hot wind was like the scorching breath which issues from red furnaces, where spirits infernal dwell. Full many a warrior brave, and many a soldier perished in that heat, consumed to ashes. Nearer to the fort, advancing, they beheld it in mid-air, but not a living thing, nor gate nor door. Yet they remained 1 week, hoping to find some hidden inlet, suffering cruel loss hour after hour, but none they could descry. At length, despairing, they returned, worn out, scorched, and half dead with watching, care, and toil. And thus Fariboz and Tus, discomfited and sad, appeared before the Persian king. Then it was Khosrow's turn, and him Kavus dispatched with Giv and Gudaz, and the troops appointed for that enterprise, and blessed them. When the young prince approached the destined scene of his exploit, he saw the blazing fort, reddening the sky and earth, and well he knew this was the work of sorcery, the spell of demon spirits. In a heavenly dream he had been taught how to destroy the charms of fell magicians, and defy their power, though by the devil himself sustained. he wrote the name of God, and piously bound it upon his javelin's point, and pressed fearlessly forward, showing it on high, and Give displayed it on the magic walls of that proud fortress, breathing forth a prayer, craving the aid of the almighty arm, when suddenly the red fires died away, and all the world was darkness. Khosrow's troops, following the orders of their prince, then shot thick clouds of arrows from 10,000 bows in the direction of the enchanted tower. The arrows fell like rain, and quickly slew a host of demons. Presently, bright light dispelled the gloom, and as the mist rolled off in sulphury circles, the surviving fiends were seen in rapid flight. The fortress, too, distinctly shone, and its prodigious gate through which the conquerors passed. Great wealth they found, and having sacked the place, Khosrow erected a lofty temple to commemorate his name and victory there, then back returned triumphantly to gladden King Kavus, whose heart expanded at the joyous news. The result of Khosrow's expedition against the enchanted castle, compared with that of Faribor's, was sufficient of itself to establish the former in the king's estimation, and accordingly it was announced to the princes and nobles and warriors of the land that he should succeed to the throne, and be crowned on a fortunate day. A short time afterwards, the coronation took place with great pomp and splendour, and Khosrow conducted himself towards men of every rank and station with such perfect kindness and benevolence that he gained the affections of all, and never failed daily to pay a visit to his grandfather Kavus, and to familiarize himself with the affairs of the kingdom which he was destined to govern. Justice he spread with equal hand, rooting oppression from the land, and every desert, wood, and wild with early cultivation smiled, and every plain with verdure clad, and every Persian heart was glad. End of the story of Siavash, Part 2, by Ferdowsi.
How the World Was Made, in Myths and Legends Around the World. Collection 10. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Joan Moy. How the World Was Made by John Morris Miller. This is the ancient Filipino account of the creation. Thousands of years ago, there was no land, nor sun, nor moon, nor stars, and the world was only a great sea of water, above which stretched the sky. The water was the kingdom of the god Maguwayan, and the sky was ruled by the great god Kaptan. Maguwayan had a daughter called Lidagat, the sea, and Kaptan had a son known as Lihangin, the wind. The gods agreed to the marriage of their children, so the sea became the bride of the wind. 3 sons and a daughter were born to them. The sons were called Likalibutan, Liadlaw, and Libulan, and the daughter received the name Lisuga. Likalibutan had a body of rock, and was strong and brave. Liadlaw was formed of gold, and was always happy. Libulan was made of copper, and was weak and timid. And the beautiful Lisuga had a body of pure silver, and was sweet and gentle. Their parents were very fond of them, and nothing was wanting to make them happy. After a time, Lihangin died, and left the control of the winds to the eldest son Likalibutan. The faithful wife Lidagat soon followed her husband, and the children, now grown up, were left without father or mother. However, their grandfathers, Kaptan and Maguwayan, took care of them and guarded them from all evil. After a time, Likalibutang, proud of his power over the winds, resolved to gain more power, and asked his brothers to join him in an attack on Kaptan in the sky above. At first, they refused, but when Likalibutang became angry with them, the amiable Liadlao, not wishing to offend his brother, agreed to help. Then together they induced the timid Libulan to join in the plan. When all was ready, the three brothers rushed at the sky, but they could not beat down the gates of steel that guarded the entrance. Then Likalibutang let loose the strongest winds and blew the bars in every direction. The brothers rushed into the opening, but were met by the angry god Kaptan. So terrible did he look that they turned and ran in terror. But Kaptan, furious at the destruction of his gates, sent 3 bolts of lightning after them. The first struck the copper Libulan and melted him into a ball. The second struck the golden Liadlao, and he too was melted. The third bolt struck Likalibutang, and his rocky body broke into many pieces and fell into the sea. So huge was he that parts of his body stuck out above the water and became what is known as land. In the meantime, the gentle Lisuga had missed her brothers and started to look for them. She went toward the sky, but as she approached the broken gates, Kaptan, blind with anger, struck her too with lightning, and her silver body broke into thousands of pieces. Kaptan then came down from the sky and tore the sea apart, calling on Maguwayan to come to him and accusing him of ordering the attack on the sky. Soon Maguwayan appeared and answered that he knew nothing of the plot, as he had been asleep far down in the sea. After a time, he succeeded in calming the angry Kaptan. Together, they wept at the loss of their grandchildren, especially the gentle and beautiful Lisuga, but with all their power, they could not restore the dead to life. However, they gave to each body a beautiful light that will shine forever. And so it was the golden Liadlao became the sun, and copper Libulan, the moon, while the thousands of pieces of silver Lisuga shine as the stars of heaven. To wicked Likalibutang, the gods gave no light, but resolved to make his body support a new race of people. So Kaptan gave Maguwayan a seed, and he planted it on the land, which, as you will remember, was part of Likalibutang's huge body. Soon a bamboo tree grew up, and from the hollow of one of its branches a man and a woman came out. The man's name is Sikalak, and the woman was called Sikabay. They were the parents of the human race. Their first child was a son whom they called Libo. Afterwards, they had a daughter who was known as Saman. Pandaguan was a younger son, and he had a son called Arion. Pandaguan was very clever and invented a trap to catch fish. The very first thing he caught was a huge shark. When he brought it to land, it looked so great and fierce that he thought it was surely a god, and he at once ordered his people to worship it. Soon all gathered around and began to sing and pray to the shark. Suddenly, the sky and sea opened, and the god came out and ordered Pandaguan to throw the shark back into the sea, and to worship none but them. All were afraid except Pandaguan. He grew very bold and answered that the shark was as big as the gods, and that since he had been able to overpower it, he would also be able to conquer the gods. Then Kaptan, hearing this, struck Pandaguan with a small thunderbolt, for he did not wish to kill him, but merely to teach him a lesson. Then he and Magawayan decided to punish these people by scattering them over the earth. So they carried some to one land and some to another. Many children were afterwards born, and thus the earth became inhabited in all parts. Pandaguan did not die. After lying on the ground for 30 days, he regained his strength, but his body was blackened from the lightning, and all his descendants ever since that day have been black. His first son, Arion, was taken north, but as he had been born before his father's punishment, he did not lose his color, and all his people therefore are white. Libo and Saman were carried south, where the hot sun scorched their body and caused all their descendants to be of a brown color. A son of Saman and a daughter of Sikalak were carried east, where the land at first was so lacking in food that they were compelled to eat clay. On this account, their children and their children's children have always been yellow in color. And so the world came to be made and peopled. The sun and moon shine in the sky, and the beautiful stars light up the night. All over the land, on the body of the envious Sikalibutan, the children of Sikalak and Sikabay were grown great in numbers. May they live forever in peace and brotherly love. End of How the World Was Made.
Setuli, or the King of the Birds, in Myths and Legends Around the World, Collection 10. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Alroy. Fairy Tales from South Africa by E.J. Bournehill and J.B. Drake. Chapter number 1. Setuli, or the King of the Birds. A Swazi Tale. Many, many years ago there lived a poor man named Setuli, who was deaf and dumb. He had never been able to speak or understand anything but signs from his birth, and was despised by all his brothers and sisters. Although he was the son of a powerful chief, no one so much as looked at him, and he could never hope to win a bride or have a home of his own. He had but one friend, an elder brother, who gave him food and shelter, and was always kind to him. This brother was already old, and was known as a great magician. He knew the properties of every herb, and the wonderful powers possessed by birds and beasts. When he went to search for magic roots, he always took Setuli with him, for he found his eyes were quicker than those of any man in the countryside, and his fingers more deft. One day in spring, when the first rains had fallen, and green shoots were showing among the dry grass, the two brothers went out to gather roots as usual. They travelled far into the mountains, till they reached a narrow valley full of trees just bursting into leaf. A clear stream ran down one side among great boulders. Ferns were just uncurling their early fronds, and in sheltered nooks big scarlet daisies shone like tiny suns. The old magician and Setuli set to work at once, for here many rare plants flourished. They had been at work an hour or more, when a swarm of beautiful black birds with long waving tails came towards them, flying in a zigzag course. They settled on the low bushes, swinging up and down on the branches and balancing their long tails. The two brothers both looked up, and in a grave voice the old magician said to the birds, "Sakubulas! We go to sleep and we get up as we used to." This was the magic greeting they expected. I cannot tell you what it meant, but when the Sakubulas heard it, they flew away quite satisfied. The two brothers went on digging and moved further up the stream. Then a great swarm of dear little rooibekkies suddenly appeared, tiny little brown birds with pink breasts and bright red bills. They fluttered all around, chattering gaily. The old magician again looked up. "Mansiani," he said, "we go to sleep and we get up as we used to." And the rooibekkies flew away quite satisfied. Then the two brothers went on digging again and worked for a long time. All at once there rushed upon them an immense flight of the most beautiful birds, shining from head to foot with glorious yellow plumage. Round their necks showed a ring of velvety black, and there were black feathers in their wings. "Follow us up! Follow us up!" they cried to the two brothers. "These are orioles," said the old magician. "Without doubt, some great adventure is before us." He signed to his brother to leave the roots and follow the birds. They travelled over the mountains for 3 days and 3 nights, and followed the golden birds. On the morning of the 4th day, the birds led them down a steep mountainside to a deep green valley through which ran a wide stream. The birds followed the stream till they came to a deep clear pool under the shadow of great trees. It was very cool and very still. Tall reeds and big white lilies grew all around the water's edge, and over the pool itself were hundreds of water lilies, white and purple. The golden birds turned to the magician and said, "Bring your brother here and tell him on no account to be afraid. No matter what may happen to him, he must wait by the edge of the pool amongst the reeds and lilies." The elder brother fetched Satuli and made him understand what was wanted of him. Then he went away and left his brother alone, wondering what this new adventure would bring. Now, though Satuli had always been despised and set aside by all his relations, he was in reality both wise and brave. He sat down at the water's edge and remained perfectly still. Suddenly the waters moved, and up rose a huge alligator. It came straight towards him, lashing its great tail and opening its huge jaws. Its teeth glistened in the sun, and as it walked up the bank, it snapped at Satuli and blinked its wicked little eyes. But Satuli sat perfectly still and pretended not to notice. The alligator thrust its long nose almost in his face, snapped its jaws once more, and then, seeing he showed no sign of fear, turned tail and slipped into the pool again. Satuli remained sitting, waiting to see what would happen next. For a little while the pool was still. Then the whole of the waters moved, and out came a huge ogre, far more hideous and terrible than the alligator. He was covered with eyes and glared with every one of them at the deaf man. Then he roared fiercely and sprang towards him, but still Satuli did not move so much as an eyelid. The ogre shouted again and then disappeared, like the alligator before him. After that, there was no sound or motion for many hours. Satuli sat watching by the pool. Just as he began to think nothing more would happen, the water moved quietly, and out came a fairy in the shape of an old woman. She stood in the waters up to her waist and gazed at Setuli. On her right hand they perched a beautiful black sakubula. On her left hand a little rooibekkie, and on her head was a most wonderful aureole, bright as the rising moon. The old woman continued to gaze at Setuli and said 3 times in a loud voice, "Speak!" When she uttered the 3rd word, Setuli felt a new power had come to him. He could speak like other people, and he could understand all the fairies said. "Go to your brother and show him you are cured. I have known both of you long and have determined to help you. Whatever you want in the future you shall receive. You have only to ask for it." The fairy vanished, and the 3 birds flew away. Setuli soon found his brother, and the old man's astonishment was great when he heard the deaf man speak. Setuli in his turn was much surprised to find the 3 swarms of birds again, just as he had left them on his journey out. They flew in 3 separate companies, and at the head of each company was one more beautiful than the others, evidently the leader. Setuli soon saw these were the very birds who had accompanied the fairy. No doubt she had sent them for his use. He thought deeply for a time, and then made new plans. The result you shall soon hear. The 2 brothers journeyed on till they saw a great storm rising. The sky was blue-black, and a noise could be heard like continuous thunder. "That is hail," cried the magician. "We shall be caught here in the open. Nothing can save us from death." "Do not fear," said Setuli. "Wait, and you shall see." He gave a command, and instantly 1,000 huts appeared. His brother gazed in astonishment and delight. Then he said, "What do we want with so many huts? There is no one to shelter but you and me." "I shall want huts for my soldiers and people," said Setuli. Then he turned to the companies of birds and changed them all with one word into warriors. The Sakubulas became his first regiment. They were great tall men, clad in leopard skins, holding in their hands assegais and huge shields of oxhide. But one thing remained of their former state. Each man wore on his head a huge cap of the long tail feathers of the Sakubula. They stood in line, saluted their chief, and marched to their huts. Then came the golden orioles. These were Setuli's bodyguard, and were even finer than the Sakubulas. Their skins were of the silver jackal. Round their knees and arms were bracelets of white oxtails, and on their hands were long black ostrich plumes. Before them stood the golden oriole, bright as the rising moon, now the general in command, next to Setuli himself. Last of all came the rooibekkies. These became the little umfans, the lads who carry all the baggage of the army and wait on the grown men. Setuli sent them all to their huts just as the first hailstones struck the ground. For an hour no one stirred. The sound of the storm was like continuous roaring thunder. The hailstones were as large as great plums, jagged and sharp as crystals. Every tree was stripped of its leaves, and all the birds and beasts who could not find shelter were killed or maimed. When the storm ceased, the hail lay in icy heaps in every hollow, and the air was frosty and cold, as in midwinter in the high mountains. A raw mist rose from the valleys, but Setuli felt no cold. His heart was great within him, for now he had proved his powers. He called out his troops once more, and reviewed them with joy and pride. "We shall go forth and conquer a great kingdom," he said to his brother. "I shall yet be a rich man." The regiments shouted, "Bayeta!" the salute which is given only to the chief, and swore to follow where Setuli led. Generals were appointed for each division of the army, the 3 leaders being the birds, who sat on the fairies' hands. There was no trouble about provisions or shelter, for Setuli had only to ask for food, and there was abundance for all. He now determined to search for a kingdom to conquer. He left the country of mountains and wooded valleys, and went up to the great tableland to search for new people to overcome. He travelled with his army for a year, but never saw so much as one little hut. The land was empty. On every side was waving grass, extending as far as the eye could reach, but no path appeared, nor any tree. Great herds of buck sometimes came towards them, and then followed fine hunting, but no man or woman could they find, though they travelled for many months. At last they turned back towards the low country, and at the end of a year they came to a range of mountains overlooking an immense plain. Below they saw great cities surrounded by fields of mealies. Thousands of cattle roamed on the hills. They had but to descend and seize all they wanted. Setuli bade his men camp in a great valley which could not be seen from the plain. Then he sent spies to find out how strong the cities were and how big was the king's army. But first his brother the magician gave them a wonderful potion which made them invisible, so that no one should suspect them. "The people," cried they, "are all deaf and dumb. They have but one arm, and walk on one leg only. Not only that, but as soon as we approached them we found we were becoming deaf and dumb also, so we ran back as quickly as possible." This troubled Setuli very much. "Don't go near these people," said he. "Let us get right away from the towns and go hunting in the mountains." Now Setuli was very wise, and had, besides the advice of his brother, the great magician, he had determined to take possession of all the inhabitants of this country and drive away all their cattle. But he felt sure some powerful monster ruled over them, who would first have to be discovered and destroyed. The only thing to do was to devise some means of attracting him to the camp and killing him unawares. The big hunt was arranged, and an immense number of birds were taken, of all shapes and colours. Setuli drew a feather out of the tail of every bird, and made a huge many-coloured ball, which he wore as a headdress and as a protection for himself, for magic power was in the feathers. Then he allowed preparations to be made for the great feast which followed the hunt, but gave special directions to his men. "Do not eat all the birds," he said. "Place half of those you have killed in front of the huts. Put first a whole bird, then the head of a bird you have eaten, in long rows all around the camp, and then put a treble row about my own hut." The men carried out these commands carefully, and soon the whole camp was surrounded with dead birds of every hue and shape. When all the feasting was over, and the camp quite still, Setuli crept out of his hut and hid behind the screen which sheltered the entrance. It was full moon, and the country shone like silver. Sharp, inky black shadows showed near the river where the bushes grew, and round each hut was a dark, narrow ring in which no object was visible. Setuli crouched behind his screen of reeds. The camp was absolutely still and deserted. Towards midnight he heard heavy footsteps approaching. Every now and then they stopped. Then they began again. Setuli stooped lower. Without doubt the monster who owned all the cities in the plain was approaching. The footsteps were not even. They resembled someone hopping very heavily. Presently a huge black figure came in sight, holding a long assegai. He had but one leg and one arm, and stopped greedily at every hut to eat the birds which lay there. As he came nearer, Setuli saw that he was of unimaginable ugliness. His eyes were divided. One was in the middle of his forehead, and the other at the back of his head, so that whichever way he stood he saw you, and you could not escape him. At the entrance of Setuli's hut he stopped, gave a snarl of delight at the sight of so many birds, and sat down to enjoy them. He had but one arm, so he laid his assegai down just before the door screen. Setuli asked for no better chance. He rose quickly, seized the assegai, and stabbed the monster in the neck. He rolled over with a groan and lay quite still, apparently dead. With a joyous heart, Setuli roused all his men, and at break of day led them into the great plain. To their surprise, they found the people walking on two legs, and talking as well as themselves. The death of the ogre relieved the people from the bonds of a wicked enchantment, and they were only too glad to go with Setuli and his men, they and all their cattle. By evening all was in order for the march, and at earliest dawn the company started for the mountains. They had gone a whole day's journey, and had reached a point high above the great plain, when Setuli discovered that he had lost his ball of feathers. He did not wish to turn his followers back, but neither could he bear to travel further without his headdress, for it had magic power, and it might be long before he could get such another. So he bade his army go on under the leadership of his brother, and went down the mountain paths as fast as possible, till he came to the valley in which they had camped. There he saw a sight which made his heart stand still. The ogre whom he had left for dead was sitting up, alive and well, and around him danced and romped hundreds of little ogres, all with one leg and one arm like their father. They tossed the magic ball of feathers from one to another and shouted with glee. Setuli saw he must risk all and trust to his swift feet to get away. He ran in suddenly, seized the ball of feathers, and turned quickly away up the mountain path. As he touched the ball, all the little ogres vanished like smoke. Only the big one remained, and for a moment he was dazed and did not understand what had happened. Then he got up and stamped after Setuli with astonishing speed. It was all Setuli could do to keep the distance between them, but he was strong and knew the paths. They leapt from rock to rock, in and out among the trees, till they came to the grassy slopes which led to the great pass. They climbed all day till the sun began to set. Then at the very top of the mountain range, Setuli found his army camped along the side of a deep ravine. Below was a valley many hundreds of feet deep, lined with huge rocks and great trees. Beyond, many weary hours away, rose another mountain with green slopes marked with a course of many streams. "Bayeta!" cried the army when they saw their chief. "My men," cried Setuli, "we have not a moment to lose. Our enemy is behind us, and we shall soon be in his hands. Let every man, woman, and child fix his eyes on the mountainside opposite, and then leap with all his might." Setuli could hear his enemy behind him, as his people leapt together into the air. He ran forward, touched the cattle with his ball of feathers, and they too jumped with all their might. All landed safely on the other side, and placed the great ravine between them and the terrible ogre. Setuli jumped last, just as the monster, breathless and exhausted, reached the edge of the precipice. Twilight set in, and when the sun rose next morning, Setuli and all his people found themselves in perfect safety, and set forth once more on their journey. They travelled all day, and at sunset came to the most beautiful valley they had ever beheld. It lay far below them, wide, green, and fertile. Down its centre flowed a clear stream, shaded by great tree ferns, and bordered with thick green bushes covered with scarlet flowers. The valley extended as far as the eye could see towards the setting sun. All the hills on either side were closely wooded and well watered. Setuli turned to his brother and said, "This is the finest country I have ever seen. We will settle here with all our men." At the end of the valley was a very large kraal, wherein dwelt the chief of the country. Setuli determined to win him over to his side and make him his man. So he took his bodyguard and marched down the mountain paths to the gate of the kraal. Just as they approached the chief's hut, he struck every one of his men on the leg with his magic assegai. They at once began to walk, every man on one leg. "Never have I seen such magic power," said the chief. "You shall be our king and protect us against all our enemies." "I will show you yet more marvels," said Setuli. He struck his men once more, and they all walked like ordinary human beings. While the chief still stared in open-mouthed wonder, he turned to the mountainside and shouted, "Men, appear!" Instantly, from top to bottom of the great hill, stood line upon line of magnificent warriors, clad in leopard skins and holding white shields. They lifted their right hands and shouted, "Baeta!" so that the cry echoed like thunder from side to side of the valley. Then Setuli shouted once more, "Men, disappear!" And at once the hillside was empty and silent. "You see," said Setuli, "I have men at my command whenever we need them." "You shall certainly be our king," cried all the people. So Setuli and his brother and all the men and women who belonged to them stayed in the valley and lived in great peace and happiness all their lives long. The end of Setuli, or the King of the Birds.
The story of Prometheus in Myths and Legends Around the World. Collection 10. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Ollie A.G. The Story of Prometheus by James Baldwin. Chapter 1. How Fire Was Given to Men. In those old times, there lived two brothers who were not like other men, nor yet like those mighty ones who lived upon the mountain top. They were the sons of one of those Titans who had fought against Jupiter and been sent in chains to the strong prison house of the lower world. The name of the elder of these brothers was Prometheus, or Forethought, for he was always thinking of the future and making things ready for what might happen tomorrow, or next week, or next year, or it may be in 100 years to come. The younger was called Epimetheus, or Afterthought, for he was always so busy thinking of yesterday, or last year, or 100 years ago, that he had no care at all for what might come to pass after a while. For some cause, Jupiter had not sent these brothers to prison with the rest of the Titans. Prometheus did not care to live amid the clouds on the mountain top. He was too busy for that. While the mighty folk were spending their time in idleness, drinking nectar and eating ambrosia, he was intent upon plans for making the world wiser and better than it had ever been before. He went out amongst men to live with them and help them, for his heart was filled with sadness when he found out that they were no longer happy as they had been during the golden days when Saturn was king. Ah, how very poor and wretched they were! He found them living in caves and in holes of the earth, shivering with the cold because there was no fire, dying of starvation, hunted by wild beasts and by one another, the most miserable of all living creatures. If only they had fire, said Prometheus to himself, they could at least warm themselves and cook their food, and after a while they could learn to make tools and build themselves houses. Without fire, they are worse off than the beasts. Then he went boldly to Jupiter and begged him to give fire to men, that so they might have a little comfort through the long, dreary months of winter. Not a spark will I give, said Jupiter. No, indeed. Why? If men had fire, they might become strong and wise like ourselves, and after a while they would drive us out of our kingdom. Let them shiver with cold, and let them live like the beasts. It is best for them to be poor and ignorant, that so we mighty ones may thrive and be happy. Prometheus made no answer, but he had set his heart on helping mankind, and he did not give up. He turned away and left Jupiter and his mighty company forever. As he was walking by the shore of the sea, he found a reed, or, as some say, a tall stalk of fennel, growing. And when he had broken it off, he saw that its hollow center was filled with a dry, soft pith, which would burn slowly and keep on fire a long time. He took the long stalk in his hands and started with it towards the dwelling of the sun in the far east. Mankind shall have fire in spite of the tyrant who sits on the mountain top, he said. He reached the place of the sun in the early morning just as the glowing, golden orb was rising from the earth and beginning his daily journey through the sky. He touched the end of the long reed to the flames, and the dry pith caught on fire and burned slowly. Then he turned and hastened back to his own land, carrying with him the precious spark hidden in the hollow center of the plant. He called some of the shivering men from their caves and built a fire for them, and showed them how to warm themselves by it and how to build other fires from the coals. Soon there was a cheerful blaze in every rude home in the land, and men and women gathered round it and were warm and happy, and thankful to Prometheus for the wonderful gift which he had brought to them from the sun. It was not long until they learned to cook their food and so to eat like men instead of like beasts. They began at once to leave off their wild and savage habits, and instead of lurking in the dark places of the world, they came out into the open air and the bright sunlight, and were glad because life had been given to them. After that, Prometheus taught them, little by little, 1,000 things. He showed them how to build houses of wood and stone, and how to tame sheep and cattle and make them useful, and how to plow and sow and reap, and how to protect themselves from the storms of winter and the beasts of the woods. Then he showed them how to dig in the earth for copper and iron, and how to melt the ore, and how to hammer it into shape and fashion from it the tools and weapons which they needed in peace and war. And when he saw how happy the world was becoming, he cried out, "A new golden age shall come, brighter and better by far than the old." Chapter 2. How diseases and cares came among men. Things might have gone on very happily indeed, and the golden age might really have come again, had it not been for Jupiter. But one day, when he chanced to look down upon the earth, he saw the fires burning, and the people living in houses, and the flocks feeding on the hills, and the grain ripening in the fields, and this made him very angry. "Who has done all this?" he asked. And someone answered, "Prometheus." "What? That young Titan?" he cried. "Well, I will punish him in a way that will make him wish I had shut him up in the prison house with his kinsfolk. But as for those puny men, let them keep their fire. I will make them 10 times more miserable than they were before they had it." Of course, it would be easy enough to deal with Prometheus at any time, and so Jupiter was in no great haste about it. He made up his mind to distress mankind first, and he thought of a plan for doing it in a very strange, roundabout way. In the first place, he ordered his blacksmith Vulcan, whose forge was in the crater of a burning mountain, to take a lump of clay which he gave him, and mold it into the form of a woman. Vulcan did as he was bidden, and when he had finished the image, he carried it up to Jupiter, who was sitting among the clouds with all the mighty folk around him. It was nothing but a mere lifeless body, but the great blacksmith had given it a form more perfect than that of any statue that has ever been made. "Come, now," said Jupiter, "let us all give some goodly gift to this woman." And he began by giving her life. Then the others came in their turn, each with a gift for the marvelous creature. One gave her beauty, and another a pleasant voice, and another good manners, and another a kind heart, and another skill in many arts, and, lastly, someone gave her curiosity. Then they called her Pandora, which means the all-gifted, because she had received gifts from them all. Pandora was so beautiful and so wondrously gifted that no one could help loving her. When the mighty folk had admired her for a time, they gave her to Mercury, the light-footed, and he led her down the mountainside to the place where Prometheus and his brother were living and toiling for the good of mankind. He met Epimetheus first, and said to him, "Epimetheus, here is a beautiful woman whom Jupiter has sent to be your wife." Prometheus had often warned his brother to beware of any gift that Jupiter might send, for he knew that the mighty tyrant could not be trusted. But when Epimetheus saw Pandora, how lovely and wise she was, he forgot all warnings, and took her home to live with him and be his wife. Pandora was very happy in her new home, and even Prometheus, when he saw her, was pleased with her loveliness. She had brought with her a golden casket, which Jupiter had given her at parting, and which he had told her held many precious things. But wise Athena, the queen of the air, had warned her never to open it, nor look at the things inside. They must be jewels, she said to herself. And then she thought of how they would add to her beauty if only she could wear them. Why did Jupiter give them to me if I should never use them, nor so much as look at them? She asked. The more she thought about the golden casket, the more curious she was to see what was in it, and every day she took it down from its shelf and felt of the lid, and tried to peer inside of it without opening it. Why should I care for what Athena told me? She said at last. She is not beautiful, and jewels would be of no use to her. I think that I will look at them at any rate. Athena will never know. Nobody else will ever know. She opened the lid a very little, just to peep inside. All at once there was a whirring, rustling sound, and before she could shut it down again, out flew 10,000 strange creatures with death-like faces and gaunt and dreadful forms, such as nobody in all the world had ever seen. They fluttered for a little while about the room, and then flew away to find dwelling places wherever there were homes of men. They were diseases and cares, for up to that time mankind had not had any kind of sickness, nor felt any troubles of mind, nor worried about what the morrow might bring forth. These creatures flew into every house, and, without anyone seeing them, nestled down in the bosoms of men and women and children, and put an end to all their joy. And ever since that day they have been flitting and creeping, unseen and unheard, all over the land, bringing pain and sorrow and death into every household. If Pandora had not shut down the lid so quickly, things would have gone much worse. But she closed it just in time to keep the last of the evil creatures from getting out. The name of this creature was Foreboding, and although he was almost half out of the casket, Pandora pushed him back and shut the lid so tight that he could never escape. If he had gone out into the world, men would have known from childhood just what troubles were going to come to them every day of their lives, and they would never have had any joy or hope so long as they lived. And this was the way in which Jupiter sought to make mankind more miserable than they had been before Prometheus had befriended them. Chapter 3. How the Friend of Men was Punished. The next thing that Jupiter did was to punish Prometheus for stealing fire from the sun. He bade 2 of his servants, whose names were Strength and Force, to seize the bold Titan and carry him to the topmost peak of the Caucasus Mountains. Then he sent the blacksmith Vulcan to bind him with iron chains and fetter him to the rocks, so that he could not move hand or foot. Vulcan did not like to do this, for he was a friend of Prometheus. And yet he did not dare to disobey. And so the great friend of men, who had given them fire and lifted them out of their wretchedness and shown them how to live, was chained to the mountain peak. And there he hung, with the storm winds whistling always around him, and the pitiless hail beating in his face, and fierce eagles shrieking in his ears and tearing his body with their cruel claws. Yet he bore all his sufferings without a groan, and never would he beg for mercy or say that he was sorry for what he had done. Year after year, and age after age, Prometheus hung there. Now and then old Helios, the driver of the sun car, would look down upon him and smile. Now and then flocks of birds would bring him messages from far-off lands. Once the ocean nymphs came and sang wonderful songs in his hearing, and oftentimes men looked up to him with pitying eyes and cried out against the tyrant who had placed him there. Then, once upon a time, a white cow passed that way, a strangely beautiful cow, with large, sad eyes and a face that seemed almost human. She stopped and looked up at the cold grey peak and the giant body which was chained there. Prometheus saw her and spoke to her kindly. "I know who you are," he said. "You are Io, who was once a fair and happy maiden in distant Argos, and now, because of the tyrant Jupiter and his jealous queen, you are doomed to wander from land to land in that unhuman form. But do not lose hope. Go on to the southward and then to the west, and after many days you shall come to the great river Nile. There you shall again become a maiden, but fairer and more beautiful than before, and you shall become the wife of the king of that land, and shall give birth to a son, from whom shall spring the hero who will break my chains and set me free. As for me, I bide in patience the day which not even Jupiter can hasten or delay. Farewell." Poor Io would have spoken, but she could not. Her sorrowful eyes looked once more at the suffering hero on the peak, and then she turned and began her long and tiresome journey to the land of the Nile. Ages passed, and at last a great hero whose name was Hercules came to the land of the Caucasus. In spite of Jupiter's dread thunderbolts and fearful storms of snow and sleet, he climbed the rugged mountain peak. He slew the fierce eagles that had so long tormented the helpless prisoner on those craggy heights, and with a mighty blow he broke the fetters of Prometheus and set the grand old hero free. "I knew that you would come," said Prometheus. 10 generations ago I spoke of you to Io, who was afterwards the queen of the land of the Nile. And Io, said Hercules, was the mother of the race from which I am sprung. End of the story of Prometheus. The story of Io in Myths and Legends Around the World, Collection 10. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Ollie A.G. The Story of Io by James Baldwin. In the town of Argos there lived a maiden named Io. She was so fair and good that all who knew her loved her, and said that there was no one like her in the whole world. When Jupiter, in his home in the clouds, heard of her, he came down to Argos to see her. She pleased him so much, and was so kind and wise, that he came back the next day, and the next, and the next, and by he stayed in Argos all the time, so that he might be near her. She did not know who he was, but thought that he was a prince from some far-off land, for he came in the guise of a young man, and did not look like the great king of earth and sky that he was. But Juno, the queen who lived with Jupiter and shared his throne in the midst of the clouds, did not love Io at all. When she heard why Jupiter stayed from home so long, she made up her mind to do the fair girl all the harm that she could, and one day she went down to Argos to try what could be done. Jupiter saw her while she was yet a great way off, and he knew why she had come. So, to save Io from her, he changed the maiden to a white cow. He thought that when Juno had gone back home, it would not be hard to give Io her own form again. But when the queen saw the cow, she knew that it was Io. "Oh, what a fine cow you have there," she said. "Give her to me. Good Jupiter, give her to me." Jupiter did not like to do this, but she coaxed so hard that at last he gave up and let her have the cow for her own. He thought that it would not be long till he could get her away from the queen and change her to a girl once more. But Juno was too wise to trust him. She took the cow by her horns and led her out of the town. "Now, my sweet maid," she said, "I will see that you stay in this shape as long as you live." Then she gave the cow in charge of a strange watchman named Argus, who had not 2 eyes only, as you and I have, but 10 times 10. And Argus led the cow to a grove, and tied her by a long rope to a tree, where she had to stand and eat grass, and cry, "Moo, moo," from morn till night. And when the sun had set, and it was dark, she lay down on the cold ground and wept, and cried, "Moo, moo," till she fell asleep. But no kind friend heard her, and no one came to help her, for none but Jupiter and Juno knew that the white cow who stood in the grove was Io, whom all the world loved. Day in and day out, Argus, who was all eyes, sat on a hill close by and kept watch. And you could not say that he went to sleep at all, for while half of his eyes were shut, the other half were wide awake, and thus they slept and watched by turns. Jupiter was grieved when he saw to what a hard life Io had been doomed, and he tried to think of some plan to set her free. One day he called sly Mercury, who had wings on his shoes, and bade him go and lead the cow away from the grove where she was kept. Mercury went down and stood near the foot of the hill where Argus sat, and began to play sweet tunes on his flute. This was just what the strange watchman liked to hear, and so he called to Mercury and asked him to come up and sit by his side and play still other tunes. Mercury did as he was wished, and played such strains of sweet music as no one in all the world has heard from that day to this. And as he played, queer old Argus lay down upon the grass and listened, and thought that he had not so great a treat in all his life. But by and by those sweet sounds wrapped him in so strange a spell that all his eyes closed at once, and he fell into a deep sleep. This was just what Mercury wished. It was not a brave thing to do, and yet he drew a long, sharp knife from his belt and cut off the head of poor Argus while he slept. Then he ran down the hill to loose the cow and lead her to the town. But Juno had seen him kill her watchman, and she met him on the road. She cried out to him and told him to let the cow go, and her face was so full of wrath that, as soon as he saw her, he turned and fled, and left poor Io to her fate. Juno was so much grieved when she saw Argus stretched dead in the grass on the hilltop, that she took his 100 eyes and set them in the tail of a peacock, and there you may still see them to this day. Then she found a great gadfly, as big as a bat, and sent it to buzz in the white cow's ears, and to bite her and sting her so that she could have no rest all day long. Poor Io ran from place to place to get out of its way, but it buzzed and stung, till she was wild with fright and pain, and wished that she were dead. Day after day she ran, now through the thick woods, now in the long grass that grew on the treeless plains, and now by the shore of the sea. By and by she came to a narrow neck of the sea, and, since the land on the other side looked as though she might find rest there, she leaped into the waves and swam across. And that place has been called Bosphorus, a word which means the Sea of the Cow, from that time till now, and you will find it so marked on the maps which you use at school. Then she went on through a strange land on the other side, but, let her do what she would, she could not get rid of the gadfly. After a time she came to a place where there were high mountains with snow-capped peaks which seemed to touch the sky. There she stopped to rest a while, and she looked up at the calm, cold cliffs above her, and wished that she might die where all was so grand and still. But as she looked, she saw a giant form stretched upon the rocks midway between earth and sky, and she knew at once that it was Prometheus, the young Titan, whom Jupiter had chained there because he had given fire to men. My sufferings are not so great as his, she thought, and her eyes were filled with tears. Then Prometheus looked down and spoke to her, and his voice was very mild and kind. "I know who you are," he said, and then he told her not to lose hope, but to go south and then west, and she would by and by find a place in which to rest. She would have thanked him if she could, but when she tried to speak, she could only say, "Moo, moo." Then Prometheus went on and told her that the time would come when she should be given her own form again, and that she should live to be the mother of a race of heroes. "As for me," said he, "I bide the time in patience, for I know that one of those heroes will break my chains and set me free. Farewell." Then Io, with a brave heart, left the great Titan and journeyed, as he had told her, first south and then west. The gadfly was worse now than before, but she did not fear it half so much, for her heart was full of hope. For a whole year she wandered, and at last she came to the land of Egypt in Africa. She felt so tired now that she could go no farther, and so she lay down near the bank of the great river Nile to rest. All this time Jupiter might have helped her had he not been so much afraid of Juno. But now it so chanced that when the poor cow lay down by the bank of the Nile, Queen Juno, in her high house in the clouds, also lay down to take a nap. As soon as she was sound asleep, Jupiter like a flash of light sped over the sea to Egypt. He killed the cruel gadfly and threw it into the river. Then he stroked the cow's head with his hand, and the cow was seen no more, but in her place stood the young girl Io, pale and frail, but fair and good as she had been in her old home in the town of Argos. Jupiter said not a word, nor even showed himself to the tired, trembling maiden. He hurried back with all speed to his high home in the clouds, for he feared that Juno might waken and find out what he had done. The people of Egypt were kind to Io, and gave her a home in their sunny land. And by the king of Egypt asked her to be his wife, and made her his queen, and she lived a long and happy life in his marble palace on the bank of the Nile. Ages afterward, the great-grandson of the great-grandson of Io's great-grandson broke the chains of Prometheus and set that mighty friend of mankind free. The name of the hero was Hercules. End of the story of Io.
The Deformed of Zor, in Myths and Legends Around the World, Collection 10. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Nathaniel Matala of Schenectady, New York. The Valley of Zor in western New York is so surrounded by hills that its discoverers, a religious people who gave it a name from Scripture, said, "This is Zor. It is impregnable. From her we will never go." And truly, for lack of roads, they found it so hard to get out, having got in, that they did not leave it. Among the early settlers here were people of a family named Wright, whose house became a sort of inn for the infrequent traveler, inasmuch as they were not troubled with piety, and had no scruples against the selling of drink and the playing of cards at late hours. A peddler passed through the valley on his way to Buffalo, and stopped at the Wright house for a lodging. But before he went to bed he incautiously showed a number of golden trinkets from his pack, and drew a considerable quantity of money out of his pocket when he paid the fee for his lodging. Hardly had he fallen asleep before his greedy hosts were in the room, searching for his money. Their lack of caution caused him to wake, and as he found them rifling his pockets and his pack, he sprang up and showed fight. A blow sent him to the bottom of the stairs, where his attempt to escape was intercepted, and the family closed around him and bound his arms and legs. They showed him the money they had taken, and asked where he had concealed the rest. He vowed that it was all he had. They insisted that he had more, and seizing a knife from the table, the elder Wright slashed off one of his toes to make him confess. No result came from this, and 6 toes were cut off, 3 from each foot. Then, in disgust, the unhappy peddler was knocked on the head and flung through a trap door into a shallow cellar. Presently he arose and tried to draw himself out, but with hatchet and knife they chopped away his fingers, and he fell back. Even the women shared in this work, and leaned forward to gaze into the cellar to see if he might yet be dead. While listening, they heard the man invoke the curse of heaven on them. He asked that they should wear the mark of crime even to the 4th generation, by coming into the world deformed and mutilated as he was then. And it was so. The next child born in that house had round, hoof-like feet with only 2 toes, and hands that tapered from the wrist into a single long finger. And in time there were 20 people so deformed in the valley. The crab-clawed Zorites, they were called. End of the Deformed of Zor.